Ready to go. Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another Deepest Law. We're back to talk about Adam Curtis, and this may be one of the most obscure ones today. A film about MI6 trying to overthrow the Albanian government. Just before we came on air, I caught Horace and Simon. I went to find a cigar. I'm smoking an absurdly long cigar today. It's called a Fonseca number 1, and it's a Lonsdale, which was the favorite Vitola, or the favorite cigar size of a certain Christopher Lee. Yeah, although I think he liked the Monte Cristo number 1. This is a Fonseca number 1, which is very popular in Spain, so I'm told. But I get mine specially imported. Yes, so I'm kind of sitting here like the penguin, smoking this really long cigar. But how are you doing this week, Simon?
Good, very, very good. Yes, I was interested in your cigar recommendations for the chap on Office Hours who wrote in about going to a wedding, and you gave these really interestingly precise bits of advice about duration of cigar, handling, storage. That apparently I didn't know a Churchill could take it like a couple of hours to smoke.
This one I've got here, right, which is a Lonsdale, much smaller than Churchill, is probably going to take the entire show. Right.
Okay.
I mean, I smoke too quickly, right? On the shorts, I'm puffing about 2 or 3 times every minute, right? You're meant to do it like once a minute.
Right.
Like I said, watch Evil in War, one of the old masters. Once a minute. It's just keep it enough to keep it alight and not go out. Anyway, you guys were talking about Dudley Moore and Peter Cook and the bitterness of Cook. Yeah,
there was a really interesting relationship they had. For people who are watching who may be fans of Peter Cook and Dudley Moore, they may well know the Derek and Clive albums, the kind of blue work that they did, but very, very funny, dark improvisation that they were doing towards the kind of end of their relationship. There was a sort of interesting dynamic, and I was talking to AA and Horace about there was a documentary a few years ago. I might see if I can upload it to YouTube if it's not already there, about the recording of those albums, which came at this really difficult point in their relationship where Dudley Moore had gone off to America and been quite successful. He was sort of marketed as a kind of diminutive sex pot kind of character, and he famously did films like Arthur with John Gielgud and 10 with Bo Derek, both of which kind of set him up as a sort of eccentric British, short but funny and kind of sexy in a way. And he was having this breakthrough success in America. And Cook had gone to America and kind of just he'd sort of sat there on some talk show in a chair, being the kind of a bit like a butler, not particularly being the central attraction. He never quite kind of cracked America. And Cook's famous thing was he kind of got bored in his career quite early on after doing the Footlights and Beyond the Fringe, and then starting the Establishment Club in Soho and being a brilliant satirist, and he kind of sort of lost interest in a way in performance. He'd kind of climbed all the mountains, and the recording of the Derek and Clive album is quite funny because you're seeing that Cook was absolutely tanked on booze all the time, and he was kind of going at Dudley Moore, which is sometimes difficult to detect if you listen to the records. They're very dark, very funny, but Cook is quite sort of angry in a submerged way that Moore is moving away from him, and Dudley Moore is trying to get away from him because Moore's become kind of sort of toxic and bitter. And
like the final season of Unpopular Opinions. I'm only joking.
And also because Dudley Moore had the opportunity to star alongside John Lithgow in Santa Claus the movie, which would make anyone bitter.
Yeah, you mentioned I'd not heard of that one.
But one of my questions about Derek and Clive, though, or Dudley Moore and Peter Cook. I mean, Dudley Moore was the straight man, right? He wasn't meant to be. Cook was the funny one, and Moore was the straight man.
He was the Ernie Wise to Cook's Eric Morecambe. Yeah.
So this dynamic is kind of interesting to me, that you get one funny one straight man, because not all double acts have that. Yeah. For example, in the two Ronnies, there's no straight man, is there? They're both funny. Is that?
Yeah.
In Cannon and Ball.
Yeah.
I guess Cannon is the funny one. Is that right? Or they're both unfunny?
Difficult for me to say because I wasn't in England at that time, so I don't remember them so much.
They're both the evangelical preacher one now, so
I think Ball was the funny one.
Yeah. Similar to Hale and Pace, I guess, sort of thing.
Hale and Pace were kind of both funny, I guess.
Both goofy, but the Cook-Moore relationship is one of the kind of the sadist and the gimp in a strange way. But I mean, not so much in Pete and Dud when they were on telly. They were both kind of amusing, but Moore was very aware that Cook would kind of turn a certain gaze on him and make him corpse, make him laugh, and be slightly cruel about it, especially because of Moore's height as well.
Was there a straight man in Fry and Laurie? No, they were both.
Sorry, since we're doing comedy duos, there's Little and Large as well. Does anyone even remember them? I used to watch them.
I think Sid Little was the straight man.
Yeah, that sounds.
If I had to guess, Eddie Large is usually the funny one. They're fucking awful though, those two.
Yeah, I mean, they used to have their own show on Saturdays. I used to watch.
Oh, really bad.
I would say the Fry and Laurie is possibly similar to the Cook, because Fry is always the kind of towering, slightly sadistic, authoritarian figure. It's the sort of figure that John Cleese used to be in Monty Python. There was always someone who was putting the other guy in his place, and the other guy was a bit of a dunce or a bit naive.
Was there a straight man in Smith and Jones?
No, not so much.
More Smith.
Smith was the funny one, you were saying.
Sorry, more Jones. Sorry, yeah.
You think Griff Rhys-Jones was the straight man?
It's a bit less interesting, a little bit less obviously funny, wasn't it?
He's got quite a lot of anger problems, Griff Rhys-Jones, apparently. He did a show on the BBC about his anger management issues.
Mel Smith seemed the funnier one.
It's not. Was there a straight man in Laurel and Hardy? Was like they were both meant to be funny, weren't they?
Well, the payoff was always that which one is the fat one? Oliver Hardy. Yeah. He was always kind of, that's another fine mess you've got me into. Always kind of, he was always the one who ended up getting, sort of messed up by the thing, and he would punish Stan Laurel.
And Laurel was the one who scratches his head.
Right? Yeah.
Okay.
He cries. Yeah.
It's kind of a weird thing, though, isn't it? It's like it's not always obvious, or it's not kind of set in stone. We talked about Vic and Bob the other week. They didn't have a straight man.
Yeah.
They are both naturally mad.
I guess Bob originally was the straight man.
Now that we've started this, there's just loads more comedy duos pouring into the chat. Do you want me to read them all out? There's Mighty Boosh.
Yeah, let's have some.
There's Mighty Boosh, there's Newman and Baddiel, and there's
Alex. Was Baddiel always the straight man because he's just never funny?
Not very funny, yeah.
I met Newman years later.
His entire career was literally just, I'm a Jewish guy. That's like his whole deal.
I was just going to say, I met Newman years later. There was a thing at the Soho Theatre, and got chat. I didn't know who he was because I missed out on the whole Mary Whitehouse experience thing. But what I was going to comment about him was he was quite a depressive character. very morose.
He was very.
Padilla or Newman?
He was very
Newman, but
Newman was very political. I seem to remember.
And people had told me he was kind of seen as like the sexier one in some way. He was kind of some.
Well, they sold out Wembley, those two.
Well, this is the thing, the stadium comedy, which completely bypassed me. I didn't know about this thing. I thought it was sort of faintly ridiculous when I found out about it.
Like stadium question time on the day-to-day.
I mean, David Baddiel, you have to, talk about lucking out in a career. He sold out Wembley, basically riding the coattails of Newman.
Yeah.
Then, Newman had a breakdown or he buggered off or something. And then he somehow found Frank Skinner and got on the Three Lions. They did fantasy football and had a #1 single, Three Lions on the shirt. And so how did he manage that?
And do I correctly perceive that Frank Skinner was the sort of dominant one in that relationship, like the funnier one?
Well, Frank Skinner's a very funny guy. I was as I've told you before, I was an avid fan of his radio show where I got Get Out from Frank Skinner. So, Frank Skinner's a funny guy. And Frank Skinner's also kind of weirdly conservative, if you listen to him for long enough, which sounds odd, right? But he's got a lot of weird, unexpected conservative strains in his general kind of outlook and demeanor. I don't mean politically conservative. I mean small c. Yeah. He's not naturally a kind of not a natural leftist. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah. Not non-natural sort of denizen of the Groucho Club and the whole liberal left London media.
Yeah, and he's always trying to push little folk traditions. Frank Skinner was really into ukulele playing and George Formby, right? Yeah. So just listening to the show, Frank Skinner, he almost single-handedly revived the British ukulele scene. Using his fame. I mean, just little things like that. But he was very particular, Frank Skinner. He didn't being dirty. He was always having showers, and he was always he had this very posh woman with him called Emily. I don't know if that show is still on, but it was really good for a while. And he often had, speaking of straight men, he'd often have a junior comedian with him as well. It was him, Emily, and another dude, notably a younger comedian who was just less funny than Frank Skinner. and they'd occasionally talk about comedy, and he'd just put them in there. He'd kind of put down the third wheel type thing.
It's a slight Farage syndrome there, keeping the minion under.
That sidekick, that posh girl that Skinner hung out with, she had a lot of weird things as well. She used to say that she had a wrong wood. Right, a wrong who would you do? And her wrong wood was Henry VIII. And she'd go on rants. And she'd go on rants how she never fancied George Clooney because he looked like a Greek dad on a school run and things like that. So it was a very strange dynamic, that show, but it was good. Anyway, we should probably stop rabbiting on.
No, let's continue. Let's continue. I was going to say I was very enjoying your experimental filmmaking yesterday. Driving to the lodge. That it was like an AA version of Lost Highway, or Marion and Jeff.
I think people would like to see that.
I think so. I think
Twitter exclusive, but okay, I'll share it. So
it's a sort of psychogeography of modern living.
There we go. I was late to my show yesterday, and I put this on. Here we go. Look. Oh my God, it's 2:05, 6 minutes past 2. Running late for office hours. A little casual lunch at Yummy Mummy Cafe, which overran. Is he going to make it? What are they going to do without their weekly slop? They're waiting right now. There he is, moseying slowly on some country lane somewhere. Can you believe it, ladies and gentlemen? Can you believe it? Well, let me tell you something. You don't really need to know my thoughts on Nigel Farage's takeover because you know them already. What you really want is a kind of comforting confirmation of that which you already know. I would say the vast majority of content online is a kind of comfort blanket where you get your own beliefs confirmed back to you, and you basically select your commentators based on that. So if you're a Reform supporter, you've probably already filtered me out, and you're watching someone who's ecstatic about it, or someone who wants to tell you what you want to know. If you're someone who believes that Farage is containment, you've probably selected to watch me on that basis. So, yeah, this is a little bit of meta political, kind of meta content commentary before my stream in a world's first exclusive. How'd you like them apples, eh? Huh? Trouble is, I've got my phone on the other side of my dashboard here, and I'm driving. How the hell am I going to turn it off? I will turn it off. There you go, performer. You enjoyed that, Simon, didn't you?
I love how you just don't care about technical excellence. it just happens as a kind of spontaneous. I think it was very good. It was very good. I like these little psychogeographies of modern living. I want next to see raid shopping in the carnage of the little trough world.
There was famously the search for the what was it? That drink. The drink.
Yes.
What was that stupid drink that came out?
Ridiculously priced energy drink. Yes.
You know the one made by that MMA guy, the YouTube Prime. That was it.
Prime.
Yeah, I filmed myself looking for Prime once in a Sainsbury's, and I remember saying, here's a look at Sadiq Khan's Britain, and I did a pan, and there were all these Indians going up the escalator. Do you remember?
It's very interesting what you were saying there in that stream about this culture of the algorithm. We talked about this when I was on Proper Horror Show's channel recently. We looked at Freud's essay about the uncanny and about the phenomenon of horror in the tropes that he identifies, things like puppets and doubles and things like that. And that's a kind of facet of digital culture where the algorithm creates the uncanny. It plays you back to yourself. You are your doppelganger comes through in all of your tastes, and that's how you get trapped in this theme of recursion that he identifies as forming this unsettling background to modern life.
Yeah. So okay. Well, just to we should probably get going. I'll just remind people to buy courses of the academic agency. Also, join the channel as a member. And I'm telling you this now because soon, by soon I mean after this show, a massive cache of old shows, not this show, but old videos, the daily videos I do, are going to go behind the paywall. I'm only going to keep up the ones that have got, lots and lots of views, and I'll probably paywall most of the others. I pick a number, Simon. 25,000, 30,000.
Yeah,
something like
that. That sounds good. 20,000 what?
What views?
Oh, views, right? Yeah. Okay. Yep. Okay.
Yeah. So any video that got less than 25,000 views, will be paywalled. You
don't deserve it for free.
Yeah, but also I need to add value to people who pay.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't know what level. They'll probably go on the third one up.
They're like fine wine. Some of them need to be cellared, and then they will have an afterlife, like we used to talk about a slow burn with a cult film on a VHS. It was terrible at the cinema, but then people actually realize it's brilliant years later.
One of my favorite things is people who buy memberships and then kind of randomly comment on like a 6-year-old video and things like that.
Yeah,
because it's like, oh, I haven't thought about that since it came out, or So
I watched your critiques of Lord Keynes on modern monetary theory just a couple of weeks ago. That must be about 4 or 5 years old. That was good.
Yeah, we're probably about 6 years old now. Yeah,
he's a bit of a plonker, isn't
he? Who Lord Keynes?
Yeah.
the thing is, if you're talking about Lord Keynes 2 on Twitter, right? That Lord Keynes, not the actual Lord Keynes.
Yeah.
He has weirdly become an ally in later, because despite the fact that he's a Keynesian, how can I put this, Horus? He's also like kind of a little bit racist.
Okay. Yeah, I think Keynes was a little bit as well. So yeah, that helps. But modern monetary theory is nonsense, and the critique stands.
Yes, yeah, and in fact, that modern monetary theory video, I still get comments on a daily basis. I'll tell you, I had one this morning that said, "Oh, this video, I checked the stats in this video, and I checked the stats in this video, and they're all wrong." And I just said, "Well, that's because they're 5 years. This video is 5 years old, you idiot." So, stuff like that. But all of the prices are much higher now. I'm like, well, yeah, that's the effect of modern monetary theory, you plonker.
No, all the prices are only 3% compound average growth rate per year, because that's the highest inflation goes to according to the CPI. This this documentary we're doing today, I have never heard of the documentary, and I never knew that MI6 tried to overthrow the Albanian government. I assume that's the communist government in the Cold War.
Yeah.
I never knew that happened. So this is completely new to me today. I do know who Kim Philby was.
Yeah,
So,
it's interesting. I thought it was going to be sort of dull, actually, but once you look into it, it is actually quite interesting. And Enver Hoxha, the dictator of Albania, is quite an interesting figure, and I'll bring up some stuff about him later. But what you need to watch for in this video is it's less a film about Albania than it is about the British establishment's vision of itself and its geopolitical competence.
I think that is a very interesting topic, and the Cold War cannot be boring. It's infinitely fascinating to me.
I also wanted to mention, speaking of being online 6, 7, 8 years ago, and making all my free market stuff, I remember that. How do you say his name, Simon? Hoxha?
Enver Hoxha. It's spelled Hoxha, but Enver Hoxha is how you say it.
Hoxha, right? I remember he was a darling of the online commies. They absolutely love him for some reason, and he's still popular now.
Yes.
What is the reason for that?
A lot of that was to do with the way that he actually trod quite a fine line throughout his reign. He ruled from sort of, about 1944 to 1985 or something like that. He basically often had to kind of flip his allegiances, because when he started off, he took a lot of, if you like, his inspiration and momentum from what Tito was doing in Yugoslavia. Yeah. And then with Tito, there was a split with Stalin. And Hoxha went on the side of sticking with being a satellite of the Soviet Union that was in favor of Stalin. But then, obviously, as things went on, he kind of had to denounce. Eventually, Khrushchev denounced Stalin in the mid-50s. And so, Hoxha had to kind of try to keep tracking things. And then he went in with China as well. And then, the Soviets eventually tried to overthrow him in 1960, quite a bit after, 10 years after this story takes place. So he was always kind of flipping around and essentially staying to be the one true communist. And he wrote a lot about, eventually the Soviet Union was turning into a form of communism that was basing itself on capitalism to some extent. I'll read a little bit later about that. But he
did achieve some remarkable things, though. I'll just say this, and hold your horses for us, right? Communism's bad, okay, right? I'm not saying anything else, but
good that you
he got a country that was basically medieval.
Yeah,
and he got it, I think, 75% electrified by the 70s.
Yeah.
Which is a remarkable, from a starting point of almost zero, to get the electricity grid up and running while navigating all these geopolitical kind of tangles with Stalin and China and USA and blah, 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 is remarkable. He's also another one of those communist leaders that, discovered the nationalism within communism, if that makes any sense.
That's correct. Yeah, absolutely.
So there was an aspect where he was able to kind of tap into nationalism to get Albanians to work for the greater good and so on and so forth. Maybe that's why the tankies like him, because the tankies are a weird lot, right? So
He ended up having to go the kind of personality cult route in order to navigate this thing, because in a sense Albania became very much isolated because of the way he was flipping around, and what he did was he ended up becoming an auto-generative force of Marxist purity. And I mean, he wrote 65 books, or there are 65 volumes of his collected works.
Oh, that's nothing compared to
exactly.
the thousands done by
monomaniac author
Kim Senior in North Korea. But anyway,
well, yeah, exactly. But he did. As you say, he came in and he got things very much under control. He the amount of he reduced from coming in and sort of taking over and collectivizing as in the Soviet model, and he took away private land such that it was only about 16% of land in private hands by the time he'd sort of done his thing. He came in, he purged all the kind of the Titoists, who were counter signaling against him. He cut the salaries of bureaucrats. He sent them to work in the fields. He removed all the ranks in the army. He scrapped loads of ministries, like including the Ministry of Justice. So he became a very decisionist kind of ruler. He shut down religion, destroyed the buildings, and he got women into the workforce as well. And it was very much a thing of getting them to overturn the patriarchy, which obviously was quite powerful in Albania. Yes, but he also pushed families into reproducing, and he succeeded in tripling the population over the space of 40 years.
Oh yeah, that's his other big achievement. Is he's actually one of the few leaders to actually boost the birth rate.
And he did that communist thing, as you say, of advancing an identifiable Albanian exceptionalism and a nationalism. But doing the sort of thing they did in the Soviet Union, where they'd compare them, to historical figures in cultural terms. So he very much, bigged himself up. They had only a modest amount of money from the Soviets. It was only about $200 million overall between 1948 and 1960. But what also happened was that he, as I say, he became very fierce in his advocacy for this kind of Marxist-Leninist a communism that he wrote about. Actually, interestingly, this is an interesting paragraph I want to read you from 1969, and this is the sort of level of ferocity where he was turning on the Soviet Union, or he turned on the Soviet Union. And this was a piece he wrote: "The demagogy of the Soviet revisionists cannot conceal their traitorous countenance." And this is what he wrote: "Of what fight against bourgeois ideology can the Soviet revisionists speak, while revisionism is nothing else by a manifestation of the bourgeois ideology in theory and practice, while egoism and individualism, the running after money and other material benefits, are thriving in the Soviet Union, while career-seeking and bureaucratism, technocratism, economism and intellectualism are developing, while villas, motor cars and beautiful women have become the supreme ideal of men, while literature and art attack socialism, everything revolutionary, and advocate pacifism and bourgeois humanism, the empty and dissolute living of people thinking only of themselves, while hundreds of thousands of Western tourists that visit the Soviet Union every year spread the bourgeois ideology and way of life there, while Western films cover the screens of the Soviet cinema halls, while the American orchestras and jazz bands and those of the other capitalist countries have become the favorite orchestras of the youth, and while parades of Western fashions are in vogue in the Soviet Union. If until yesterday the various manifestations of bourgeois ideology can be called remnants of the past, today bourgeois ideology has become a component part of the capitalist superstructure which rests on the state capitalist foundation which has now been established in the Soviet Union." So you can see he was very anti-jazz. He banned it. He called it jungle music.
Chad based. That was a great communist rant. I fucking love it.
He totally denounced the West as degenerate, and he purged artists, and as I say, he banned jazz. He called it the jungle music.
Just number one commie. Number one commie, this guy.
Interestingly, they built a nuclear bunker for him, the Objekti Stilla, which is nowadays an arts venue. And can you guess what it hosts? Jazz concerts.
Is it jazz? I mean, are we gonna find out that MI6 tried to overthrow this guy because he was racist or something like that? But probably,
we shall see.
Well, we can't say.
It's a bit quiet, I'm afraid, but
the Civil War in Greece. We didn't succeed in liberating Albania. Well, now you were in charge of the operations. You would know better than anybody why that happened.
Pause.
Well, I didn't.
Just a quick
That's
note on this
Julian
guy.
Amory.
That is Julian Amory, who you may remember from the Mayfair set. He was the chap in one of the clips where he was talking. Let me just see if I can bring up the quote that he had. Let me see, I can't find it now. But essentially, he was talking about the British Empire at that point. He said the prosperity of our people rests really on the oil in the Persian Gulf, the rubber and tin of Malaya, and the gold, copper, and precious metals of South and Central Africa. As long as we have access to these, as long as we can realize the investments we have there, as long as we trade with this part of the world, we should be prosperous. If the communists were to take them over, we would lose the lot. So very, very arch anti-communist.
At the time, and I know now, obviously, at the time one had no idea what the hell gone wrong, but I didn't even know for about 2 years. I mean, the Foreign Office knew, obviously.
Kishemi mendime shumë të zellshme e të mira për me shkuar me vdek për atë dheun ton, edhe nuk pes pare nuk I jepshemi pse po shkojmë me vdek. Se e dishnemi se jemi të.
Now, unfortunately, folks, this is the loudest version of this that is available, isn't it? Isn't that right, Simon?
Yeah, there's only one version out there. It seems to have been the beginning. The credits don't seem to be, or at least it just seems to lead straight into this conversation. So we're sort of crashing into this discussion. But yeah, turn your volume up if you want to hear it.
Vdek për një qëllim, e për një ide.
A very bad story of what happened.
Appalling story.
But I think
Nice
what is
cigar.
almost more
Can we
interesting
identify
is,
it?
I mean, what our intentions were, what the British-American government's intentions were.
35 years ago, these three English gentlemen set out to bring down the government of another country. They were agents working for the British Secret Service, and their task was to try to change the balance of power in the world. But their plan was to go horribly wrong, and hundreds of people were to die in a remote.
I just wanted to add that Julian Amory, he was in the League of Empire Loyalists, wasn't he? Which
Was he?
I'm a little surprised. Yeah, he was a sort of a prominent figure in that. I think I'm a little surprised, and he was pro the European unification idea as well. But I think maybe turned against it when he realised that it was going to separate Britain from the remains of the Empire, the Commonwealth. But he was also the son of Leopold Amory, who was like one of the closest allies of Churchill at the crucial moments through the 30s and 40s, and became part of his war cabinet along with Lord Lloyd. And I won't go on about him, but anyone interested in Julian Amory might want to look into Leo Amory as well. Very interesting background. And Julian Amory's brother, I believe, sided with the Nazis in the Second World War, even though the Amory family is Jewish on one side. He was a rare, part Jew who supported the Nazis and was executed after the Second World War. What a strange and mixed family. Yeah, very unusual. Wow. But Julian Amory was like a really staunch imperial sort of patriot.
Well, I'm of course extremely interested by the League of Empire Loyalists, not least because of their incredible name. Right?
Yeah,
just a clueless name. But they've got a lot. I mean, I think that Major General Richard Hilton, I think, was involved with them. I think I've got a book by A.K. Chesterton, who was involved with them for a period.
And the National Front as well, wasn't he?
Well, later on, I think they split because they were too milquetoast for Chesterton, and he went on then to be involved with other things. But in his early years, I think that Biggs Davison may have been part of them at one point.
As they've said here that Julian Amory was a secret agent, which didn't know that. I do wonder if the League of Empire Loyalists was kind of run by the state in some way.
Do you think they were feds? Well, I mean, there's an awful lot of army guys involved with the group, right. which is. And
always... the state infiltrates things that it's friendly with as well sometimes, doesn't it? So they infiltrate all sorts.
Well, in particular, in relation to Philby, who will come up later, there was a sense in which, during the period of the Second World War, if you like, admission to SIS, the Secret Intelligence Service, or MI6, as people commonly call it, was it wasn't that, well, it became more of the old boys network, and a lot of people were let in. Philby himself, when he was let in, he kind of couldn't believe how easy it was. And a lot of guys were just annexed, as in his case, as journalists, for example, working in Northwest Europe during the war, as people who would be sort of, throwing back penny packets of information. So, the nature of MI6 is such that it's not necessarily, British people going out and being spies overseas, although there's elements of things like that in the Special Operations Executive of being parachuted behind enemy lines. What you're more likely to have is you'll have case officers who are running foreign nationals in those countries who are acting as the spies and feeding information back to us. But there was this kind of periphery world of British people who had, if you like, deniable cover, who would be going over there to these places and reporting.
I mean, in fairness to the League of British Empire Loyalists, all of their stuff basically is about how traitorous the Tories are, and they're fighting rearguard action against the Americans, which is partly my interest in them came from that. But it's not necessarily the case that MI6 would have been on the side of American power, right?
Yeah, not at all.
After World War II.
It's pretty complicated.
Yeah.
Right. So it's possible that some of those elements were actually close to the state, and believe it or not, actually on the side of this country and involved in some of these institutions at the same time. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Julian Emery does seem to be a real patriot. Seems to be quite a fierce patriot.
This is very much. I mean, what we're going to discover here with Kim Philby. I mean, essentially, I've referenced John le Carré a number of times, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, but this particular episode is kind of the fundamental basis of that story. And we'll see aspects of that come out. But in le Carré's representation of that world, there's very much a division within the Secret Service that he calls the circus, between the what he calls the Atlantic men, who are kind of in favor of modernity and having close ties with what they call the cousins, which is the Americans. And there are the kind of the old, true blue kind of empire guys.
What I'm doing, Simon, right? Thinking on the fly, I was like, how am I going to fix this? I am using my video editing software to basically I've boosted the sound. Right, so we could actually fix the sound.
Nice.
What do you think about that?
Because otherwise our voices are way louder and people keep having to...
Well, otherwise it's going to be very difficult, I think, for people to... Yeah, also somebody's told me there's a typo in the stream title, which I'll fix as well. How annoying. Spelled government wrong.
Oh, doesn't matter. I called her Queen Margaret yesterday in a tweet instead of Princess Margaret. So we're just getting to that age.
You know, I had a dream last night that it was the Queen. It was the Queen. It was the day the Queen died, right? And it was like I was at the kind of funeral, right? And it was absolutely packed there. And I went down to the palace, and who was on the palace gates as the ticket guy, right, to get tickets into the Queen's funeral, but Russell Brand. And I had like an awkward conversation with Russell Brand, trying to like see the dead Queen. It was very, very strange, but
interesting.
And what's weird is that as I was trying to find an alternative version of this video, Simon,
a
video came up of Adam Curtis laying into Russell Brand, in which apparently he says that Russell Brand is like the avatar of narcissism in our culture, or something like that.
Absolutely, yeah. He's got a very interesting relationship with him. There's a good interview he does, and Russell tries to control Curtis all the time because he's very insecure. But Curtis has kind of got his number nailed.
Was that on Russell Brand's podcast? Years ago?
Yeah.
That was another. See, that was the other radio show I used to listen to. Russell Brand show and Frank Skinner. There we go. Yeah, I mean, that was a good show too, right? Mainly because of the phone-ins of Noel Gallagher.
Yeah, I mean, in a way, what Curtis identifies, just if you look at that interview with him and Russell Brand, he is kind of identifying that Russell Brand is this expression of, what Curtis goes on about, that what we call the boom of truth regime, the narcissism of the expressive individualist. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, he is he's had a bit of a fall from grace recently with the. I mean, I don't really understand. He was arrested, but he's still streaming on Rumble every day. Like, how does that work?
Yeah, I guess
is he still streaming every day, or?
Yeah, I suppose if he doesn't say anything that's sub judice, he can probably be okay. But
like, how is this circle square? Because he's literally under investigation right now by the British state for being a sex pest. But he's on stage with Jordan Peterson praying and telling people to come to Jesus. Like, what the fuck is like? How does it work?
He's literally taken a lesson from Kim Philby. There's quite an interesting clip, actually. If you look out there, Kim Philby, back in the early 80s, once he defected, he was addressing a group of men in the Stasi, and he was giving them advice on spying. And he said, whenever you get caught for anything, do not confess, deny everything. So Russell's probably following that quite successful line.
Russell Brand was charged.
Yeah.
And he's appearing in court as we speak. As we speak, Russell Brand is in court.
Yeah.
Should we go live to the courtroom?
I mean, maybe my dream was like the big man upstairs telling me, like, look, Russell, he needs you today. But anyway, that old radio show was good, mainly because grumpy Noel Gallagher would call in once in a while, and he'd say, he'd be like, he'd just have none of Russell's nonsense whatsoever, and he'd just be like, "You're a twat, aren't you?" and stuff like that. It was just, it was a good dynamic, But anyway, let's carry on.
Well, it's like guilt complex about it.
We can't say it was a victory.
Is that better, chat? I fixed the sound. Look at that, heroics.
Did stop the civil war in Greece. We didn't succeed in liberating Albania. Well, now you were in charge of the operations. You would know better than anybody why that happened.
Well, I didn't at the time, and I know now. Obviously, at the time one had no idea what the hell gone wrong. But I didn't even know for about 2 years. I mean, the Foreign Office knew, obviously.
Kishemi mendime shumë të zellshme e të mira për me shku me vdek për atë dheun ton, edhe nuk pes pare nuk I ipshemi pse po shkojmë me vdek. Se e dishnami se jemi të vdek për një qëllim e për një ide.
A very bad story, what happened.
Appalling story.
But I think what is almost more interesting is, what our intentions were.
One of the reasons I can't identify the cigar, Simon, is because back in the 80s, they didn't have the bands that they just have today. Right. It was very old school, and in fact, it was actually frowned upon in polite society to have. They were seen as ostentatious.
Yeah.
But that has changed in the past. Well, from the 90s, really, there was a bit of a cigar boom because of people like Jack Nicholson and Arnold Schwarzenegger, and who was that black guy? Jordan, was it?
Michael Jordan.
I think Michael Jordan loved a cigar. Who's the basketball guy?
Tim Westwood.
Tim Westwood, noted basketballer.
No, the cigar lovers.
Who's the Michael Jordan? He's a basketball player, right?
Michael Jordan, yeah.
Michael Jordan was famous for loving Partagas, right? And smoking bit, and the rappers loved the big Cubans, and they kind of really like. So that's where the band took off, and I still think in some extremely exclusive circles, they may take the band off as a mark of respect type thing. But
it's also vulgar, isn't it? I mean, it's the thing of, there was that thing years ago where, you kind of street hoodlums, let's say, would be keeping the labels on their caps and on their clothing. It's that ostentatious, conspicuous consumption that you're drawing attention to. Whereas for guys like this, it's rather vulgar to draw attention to your money and your brand.
Exactly. So you just don't actually know what he's smoking.
Yeah.
So
one of the lesser known Ali G interviews from back in the 90s was with this fashion designer I've never heard of called Thomas Darjevsky. And at one point, Ali G says to him, "So as a matter of taste, like, do you tend to show the label of the designer like on the chest, or do you prefer to just have it down the arm?" I love it.
Well, when we really run out of documentaries, we might just get to the point where we're watching old. I reckon those old Ali G shows might be interesting to watch now. And I remember there was the famous showdown with Tony Benn, wasn't there? And Tony Benn just didn't get it whatsoever.
Yeah, Tony Benn, you kind of makes me like him more because he just reacts so wholeheartedly. You know, he just takes him like anyone else. He's not like prejudiced against his sort of ridiculous personality. You know.
Yeah, he's a subversive character, is Sacha Baron Cohen, whose brother weirdly is like a top scientist or something. Isn't that right?
Simon Baron Cohen, isn't it, or something?
I think Simon Baron Cohen's like the man responsible for autism or something ridiculous like that. He's like a big name in that field. But anyway, let's carry on.
What the British American government's intentions were.
35 years ago, these three English gentlemen set out to bring down the government of another country. They were agents working for the British Secret Service, and their task was to try to change the balance of power in the world. But their plan was to go horribly wrong, and hundreds of people were to die in a remote country. To the world of the 1930s, Albania was a romantic, almost fictional place. Every New Year's Eve, its ruler, King Zog, held a ball in the country's capital.
This is it.
King Zog?
I just knew his new. I didn't do much research on King Zog. I just thought the name's enough to get value out of the stream. He was called King Zog of the Zogu dynasty. Not to be confused with General Zod in Superman 2, by the way.
Does that the Zogu dynasty? Does that imply that was his surname? So he's Zogu.
I won't go any further on King Zog. I don't know.
No. There's this dragon thing called Zog. Like Zog is this dragon on like kids' TV, and our Amazon Prime is desperate for my daughter to watch this thing Zog, but she never goes for it. So yeah.
Good.
Tirana. In 1937, he invited a beautiful young Hungarian debutante to be his guest.
I met him in...
You know, there'll be like half the viewership have no idea what we're laughing about Horus. Like absolutely zero idea why we find it so funny. So anyway, let's keep it like that. Let's keep it like that.
In front of a whole crowd, about 3,000 people, of diplomats and all the dignitaries of Albania. I was so embarrassed that when he gave me a champagne glass, I let it fall. At that moment, the lights went out, and everybody clapped their hands, and I was in a terrible state of embarrassment. I thought him a wonderfully handsome man. So I fell in love.
It was a fairy tale wedding.
The chat has done us proud with a couple of facts. Funny thing is, according to Donald Heiser, Zog just means bird in Albania. And Abali in the chat also adds that King Zog survived 55 assassination attempts.
Yes. That's interesting. That literally one. He was completely strapped. He had a pistol on him, and some guy tried taking a pot at him when he got out of a car, and he kind of rolled into the gutter and started blasting away at this fella.
Wow.
So yeah, he packed heat.
That must be that must even beat the Rasputin record. Assassination attempts. I mean,
as Tito was mentioned earlier, obviously Albania is right next to Yugoslavia, as was. And Tito, when Stalin died, I think this is brilliant. I learned this from Robert Service's biography of Stalin. When he died, in his desk was found not a great deal of interest, but it did. There was pay slips apparently, which he never bothered handing in because he just asked for whatever he wanted anyway. But two letters were found. This, bearing in mind, he'd been leader of the Soviet Union for over 20 odd years. 2 letters were found. One was from Bukharin, who had been the last person in senior positions to openly disagree with Stalin about policy and was executed in the Great Terror. But the other one was from Tito, and it was from, I think, the early 50s, like fairly early Cold War, after they'd fallen out, though. And it said, "Stop sending people to try and kill me, or I'll send one back, or I'll send one back to you, and they won't fuck it up like your guys do."
Wow.
I love the idea that Stalin was getting paychecks for his job as the chairman of the Inner Proscenium, or whatever his official title was. You know,
Every now and then, someone like comes in and goes, "You haven't cashed in your paychecks." Oh, sorry, I'll do it later. Sorry.
Just for gun heads out there, I think King Zog was packing a Beretta M1934. Good size pistol there, sufficient for man-stopping, 9mm. I think James Bond had one in the early books.
Do you know, Horus, how much was Stalin paid? Like, was he just on the same as a janitor in true communist fashion, or was he actually
it wasn't. Not everyone got paid the same. I think you did get paid more for being in higher positions, but very sort of, just like gentle steps upwards. But they had dachas as well. Not everyone, not everyone got a dacha. And but obviously also they'd be at banquets and stuff a lot. Well, they did still have lavish parties here and there because foreigners coming over and whatever. But in Stalin's case, it was just bring me this, bring me that. So he didn't bother. But formally, he was paid. I like to imagine that it messed up the bureaucracy a bit that he didn't cash it in. They're like that money's just sitting there. We need that to clear from the account.
Do you know who currently has a wage of 0 for us?
No.
Tony Blair. I have looked through the official things of the Tony Blair Institute, and Tony does not draw a wage.
So the whole thing is just
invisible for tax reasons.
Just out of the goodness of his own heart.
I didn't know. I didn't know how. I knew he was sort of munificent in various ways, but I didn't know quite how much.
As they say in JFK, Tony Blair walks between the raindrops.
People like you don't have to, do they?
How can he afford to work for free? That's the question. Well, anyway.
Zog, who 12 years before had ruthlessly made himself king of a...
Sorry, it's cracking me up every time he says it. But anyway.
I think when we get a screenshot of Zog, by the way, we would have to check out his dictator drip, because he's got quite a bit of style there.
Tribes now had the foundations of a dynasty, but it would only last for another year. Zog fled to exile in London, never to return. In 1944, a communist government led by Enver Hoxha took power, and Albania became a part of the new Soviet Empire.
From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic.
Yeah, well done, Winston. That's your doing, isn't it, mate? Sorry to get on my soapbox yet again. But
this is the thing.
Did you guys see the latest, by the way? I have to show you this. Sorry to interrupt, but
no, go ahead.
This is. I mean, I know I played it yesterday, but you guys have to comment on this.
I want to talk about this Lucifer idea. So Lucifer is the morning star, and he's the angel of the untrammeled intellect. That's how he's portrayed in Milton, right? And he's allied in some strange way with the serpent in the Garden of Eden.
If I might just interject, if he's the morning star, what do you do in the morning after the morning star rises?
Take a piss.
You wake up.
No.
Right.
Woke.
Right.
That's too ridiculous. It can't be real. Can't be real.
Anyway, this is
the lack of doubt. The lack of doubt on his face as he says it. Like, does he not reconsider as he's saying it? No, this is too dumb. This is too dumb. Don't say it.
Anyway, this is their hero. So,
Iron curtain has descended across the continent.
It was the start of the Cold War. Within 2 years, Berlin was blockaded, and a civil war with the communists raged in Greece.
Now, isn't it true, Horace, this speech here, or one of these speeches that Churchill gives around this time, he completely rewrote, didn't he? When the worm turned on the Soviet Union, he rewrote the speech to make it anti-Stalin. Isn't that true?
What, like he was gonna make this speech, but it would have been more favourable to them?
Well, do you remember like Boris Johnson wrote the pro-Brexit and the anti-Brexit thing, and that like he wrote 2 articles on the same day, and he went with the Brexit one, right? Churchill apparently, before he gave this speech, or one of these speeches in 1946, it was like the messaging changed, right? This was what the George Orwell thing. Oh, we were always enemies of the Eurasia or whatever, right?
Right. I've never heard that. Yeah. What I have heard about it is that he tested it out. This one that's televised was at the speech in Fulton. I think he tested out a similar speech a couple of days before or something. But the people around Truman, like, so Churchill was on a tour of America and he was like an honoured guest, like driving around with Truman, being seen with Truman. So Truman really liked him. But people around Truman said that like what Churchill was beginning to say about the Soviets is way too hostile. Like we're not actually that, they hadn't gone over to that view completely yet. They were some of them were still trying to cooperate and stuff. So they were worried that this was too strong. And this is remarked upon here and there that Churchill, his speech was seen as
it was on that tour. It was on that tour with Truman that he did the 2 speech. Like he had the 2 different speeches ready to go. And,
but that's because not that he was going to say anything positive. I think Churchill had genuinely turned against the Soviets by this point after collaborating with them to destroy the world.
This is also something that I learned about Churchill, right? He's got all of these very famous speeches, that are infinitely quotable. What you're not told is that they're speeches he like tested many times, right? So all of his famous World War II speeches, you can see him like test driving them in like 1930 and like 1918 and things like that. And so you can see a lot of his speeches in embryo, working them up, right? I'm not saying this is a diss on him, by the way. I'm just saying it's quite interesting that, there's a kind of process by which they get crystallized into these kind of amazing slogans that are still endlessly quoted today.
And there was always a thing of, wasn't there, the allegations that, the speeches used to be issued on 78 records, and there was this thing of Churchill kind of reprocessing his own mythology. And I think there was talk of like even an actor used to do his voice on some of them.
It's called Norman something. I've watched it. I think it's probably on YouTube. There's a little video of him saying, I recorded some of those, the radio ones in the war. He said he did it because Churchill was too busy. He's just
all pissed
busy doing war stuff. Right. Busy might have been the reason given out by the...
he was busy with brandy and cigars.
But no, didn't you know that Andrew Roberts says that he was only drunk once during the whole war? So,
well, that's all right then.
But that guy, he does a quick impression when he's talking about it. He does an impression of Churchill, and it is just like him. So it is plausible, but I don't know whether it's true.
I'm trying to remember. There's like a really famous one that he said it about like 20 times before the famous one. So like, this is our hour. This is the hour, or something like that. Or there's one of the really famous ones where he literally gave.
Men will still say this is their finest hour. Is that the one?
Maybe our finest. I don't know. You'd have to be like you'd have to look up Churchill speeches ever type thing, but. Yeah. There were ones where, like, I don't know, it's a trade dispute in 1932 or something, and he's rolling out like, "We will never surrender." Things like that. Like it kind of, it's weird. But anyway, let's carry on.
That there is nothing they admire so much as strength.
Churchill spoke for those who feared that the Western Allies were drifting helplessly towards yet another world war, this time with Russia. The British Foreign Office decided to fight back, in secret. A Cold War committee was set up. Its job was to find ways of liberating the Soviet satellites by any means short of war.
Here we go, Horace. Have you seen Tom Luongo? Here we go.
I'm sorry, I lost a bit there. What's the reference to Longo? Sorry.
Well, because the British Foreign Office is kind of unilaterally fighting against, like they started the Cold War before the Americans.
Right. Sorry. Yes.
Yeah,
How the
so-
British invented the Cold War.
Yeah, exactly.
One of its members, Sir Ivone Kirkpatrick, had a brainwave. Would it not be possible, he said, to start a civil war in Albania, similar to the state of affairs the Russians had produced in Greece? The committee agreed and turned for help to a man who had fought undercover in Albania during the war.
I was approached one day by friends of mine in the secret services who said, would I help them to set up the necessary organization to start a counter-revolution, I think is the right word, in Albania. And of course I was glad to do so and spent the best part of a year helping them do it.
To the intelligence service, Albania was in the front.
So I think it's correct for a man like that to be in our political parties rather than Kemi Badenoch. Call me old-fashioned, but I'm just happier with this kind of cigar chugging posho, basically, rather than, you know, Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch. It makes you feel better for it to be him. Don't you agree?
He's probably got a little bit of a rascal about him as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, you know.
And the way this happened, and the operations they're going to talk about, the main operation is Operation Valuable. That's what MI6 called it, and the CIA in America called it Operation BG Fiend. And it was also partly at the instigation of King Zog, the idea to use exiles to overthrow Enver Hoxha's communist regime, and to sort of stir up opposition to divert assistance from communist guerrillas in adjoining countries like Greece and so on. And there were several operations that went on. The Italians had one called Op Charity as well, which was using planes to infiltrate Albania, drop people by parachute, and Operation Fontana to get into ports and airfields. And the MI6 people were basically training people in Malta, as we'll discover here. And they started something called the National Committee for the Freedom of Albania. And again, going back to John le Carré, this is the kind of typical scene that you see in his book Smiley's People. It's this world of overseas resistance organizations that were based in London or Paris, of exiles from the Soviet satellites, organizing in this kind of this way of being a conduit with the secret services to transfer in paramilitaries to fight the communists.
Where is it, by the way? Is it that bit just below Yugoslavia, to the south of Yugoslavia there?
Yeah.
Or
yeah.
And to the east of it, immediately to the east is Macedonia, which was part of Yugoslavia as well.
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And when the importance of Albania, and one of the reasons they stayed allied with Stalin is that it gave the Russians access to Adriatic ports, and it also gave a reliable way for supply lines to get through to the Greek communists. So they were kind of at a strategic, pinch point there that was very useful for the Soviet Union.
Well, we still do a lot of interference in Albania. We were talking about the Dark Lord there. He was the official advisor to the Albanian government for ages. And there's something now called the Albania Plan. Are you aware of this? That has been signed jointly between Maloney in Italy, Keir Starmer, and Albania. They're going to do migrant processing, right? So let's pretend you're an illegal immigrant and you make it to that island. What's it called? Lampedusa. Lampedusa. Well, you will immediately be deported from Lampedusa to be processed in Albania now, and the Albanian government take a fee. But also, I seem to remember that Tone was instrumental in getting some other deal signed with the Albanians, and it partly accounts for why there are so bloody many Albanian gangsters here. It's actually Blair's fault. I can't remember exactly what it was now, but there's a lot of strange interference with the Albanian government and our government today now. So go on. Sorry.
It's partly going to be related to the Kosovo intervention, isn't it? Which Blair does seem to have been personally an instigator of. In that part of the world,
it is not uncommon for young men to be called Tony Blair.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, Tony Blair, right? Including like he's really popular in that part of the world. So
and in that war, I mean, so for anyone who doesn't know, Kosovo at that time was part of rump Yugoslavia, which had already lost Bosnia, Croatia, and Slovenia. So it was like Serbia, Kosovo, which was part of Serbia officially, Montenegro, and I think Macedonia were left still in Yugoslavia. And so like with Slobodan Milosevic as the head, who was Serbian, but I think he really was like a multinational Yugoslavist. You know, he did believe in that sort of civic nationalist Yugoslavian idea. He's always been portrayed as like a Serbian supremacist or something. That's not actually true. But the Kosovo War, it was like, well, and the original Yugoslav wars in the early 90s both seem to have started out of Kosovo. And it was the Kosovo Liberation Army, who were like ethnic Albanians and like Greater Albania believers, you know, like Albanian supremacists. And they were the aggressors, from what I've read. I mean, I've read, you know, revisionist stuff. And Tony Blair, and not just him, it was like Germany got in on it, and loads of people got in on it. America, obviously, Madeleine Albright and people like that, they all got in on it. But, you know, Blair was one of the instigators, and it was, we're going to support this terrorist army, and they were, by their own description, I think, terrorists, against Serbia, to help them break away from Serbia and become what is now a sort of partially recognised independent state. It's some mess. I mean, it's recognised by sort of half the world or something. It's really in between. I can't remember what was I relating that to. Something about today and Albania and
the British involvement in Albania. I mean, one of the things about Albanians, right, is that, you know, and this is something the missus complains about. She says, like, look, in her day, you know, in the 90s and stuff, going out in Chelsea, at least the gangsters had the decency to hide the fact they were gangsters, right? Whereas today, the Albanians just do not give a shit. It's just like, yes, I am a gangster. I'm going to wear the massive puffer jacket. I'm going to drive this, you know, unfeasibly expensive car around. I'm going to open a front business and make no attempt to hide the fact that this is not a real restaurant. I'm literally here to push drugs, you know, or like they are very unsubtle, the Albanians.
Back in the day, the gangsters took the bands off their cigars.
Yeah, exactly, Simon.
Like in a town near me, they opened an Albanian restaurant to wash the money through. There's no Albanian population in that town apart from gangsters. They opened a fucking Albanian restaurant. Like,
nobody ever goes to the Albanian restaurant, right?
Right, except to wash the money. Right. So, just to finish my thought, I remembered. Yeah. So where a national leader like Blair or, you know, others in America and stuff is seen to have caused a war and thus caused, you know, at least an excuse for a massive efflux of people, generally they seem to encourage it. You know, like neoconservatism seems to be invade the world and invite the world. It's the same people who believe in both. Well, Blair is one of those, right? I could totally imagine him just, you know, some years after the war, just talking to the Albanian president, just saying, well, yeah, just send us your problem people. Like, sorry, it's our fault. Or whatever. I don't even know how those conversations go, but, you know, the two things go together. We attack you, then you send us your shit people.
Yeah, there's a lot of murky deals, though. Like, because don't forget, Britain sells a lot of arms, a lot of weapons deals. But it's like, in any deal, you have to give something up. So it's like, right, well, we'll sell you weapons, we'll take you gangsters, or whatever, you know. Just one thing on the question of the classiness of gangsters, Simon. This past week, I've been spending quite a lot of time arguing with Grok as a kind of experiment, right?
Oh yes, I saw. Yeah.
Now, one of the things I started arguing with Grok about was race and criminal stats. Okay, because I wanted Grok to admit that race is basically the only factor when it comes to certain things. And I was, you know, getting all the copes down, getting all, you know, batting away. It was like a kind of kung fu match or something. And then Grok started coming out with, well, the thing is, it's about the structure of black gangs. And I said, well, hold on a second. The mafia reduced the crime rate. The Yakuza reduced the crime rate. The hierarchy and organizational structure of those older gangs is clearly downstream of the people who are in those gangs and their IQ. So, you know, this like there was a thinking for about a minute before Grok replied to that. And it couldn't get its head around the fact that it was trying to argue that the decentralized nature of the gangs were the factor. And I was like, no, why don't the other gangster organizations, why is it only those gangs? So it was using a circular argument to say the reason that reason the black crime rate is higher is because of black gangs, not recognizing the fact that, yes, because the gangs are that way because of the people who make them up. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, well, there's a guy saying it's culture, not race, but the thing is, culture, like let's say the culture of the Yakuza or the culture of the mafia, is directly downstream of the people who make up those gangs, right? Or the government of Japan or the government of Italy is downstream of the people who make up those governments. So it's like, it's funny, isn't it? So culture is literally just the same thing as race.
It's very interesting. I mean, I've mentioned on streams before, and I did a unit on South African studies at university. You know, it was sort of peremptory, but you know, one of the things that we noted about the way South African, you know, in sub-Saharan Africa, that village societies were organized very well. They weren't really that organized. There was a sort of hierarchical indolence in the menfolk. It was more or less them kind of sitting around drinking beer, collecting cattle, and it wasn't a kind of deferential hierarchy like you would say you would have in the Japanese Yakuza.
Yeah, a lack of honor. I mean, and this is even registered in. I mean, do you remember the famous Mr. Pink rant in Reservoir Dogs? I mean, I can't repeat it here because of the language, but I mean, this is kind of known. It's kind of known. Anyway, let's get. We're way off the point. Back to Albania, guys. How do we? Oh yeah, Albanian gangsters. That's how we got there.
Front line of the new threat from the east. The Russian Navy was building a submarine base there, just 50 miles from the Italian coast. It was to be a test case. If the Secret Service could engineer a counter-revolution in Albania, they could try the same thing elsewhere.
The situation was not like it is today, a rigid empire of the Soviets. It was much more fluid, and there did seem the possibility that if we took action, we could roll back the imperial tide from the east. And where better to start than a country which looked onto the sea and whose population, I was convinced from my living with them, as I had for the best part of a year, would not be in the least likely to accept Soviet domination.
MI6, headed by Sir Stuart Menzies, turned to the Americans for help. In early 1949, an American intelligence agent was sent across to a meeting at MI6's headquarters in St. James's. The problem was how to ensure that a counter-revolution would produce the right government.
You can't attempt an operation like this unless you've got a...
Sorry to laugh, but his moustache is classic. Look at that. I love that little skinny moustache. It's like, could he look any less conspicuous? I mean,
he looks like there's an actor who's in two Coen brothers films. He's in The Big Lebowski and he's in Miller's Crossing, and he's very similar. Yeah, do you know the one I mean?
He's in the Man Who Wasn't There as well, right?
Okay, you know the one I mean then. Yeah, very similar.
I feel like there's a few Danny DeVito roles where he has a you know, when Danny DeVito's in his swindler mode, right?
Yeah. The guy that Simon just mentioned is like that. Is like DeVito in a swindler mode.
Yeah.
He's always a swindler or a gangster or something. Or he's also in The Big Lebowski as a private dick, isn't he?
Yeah, and it's just looking at this guy. It's a kind of phenotype of. It's not quite what you expect of the American deep state. Do you know what I mean? It's not the kind of Ivy League WASP kind of look. It's the kind of much more. This guy would have been like, you know, running unions down on the waterfront or something.
Yeah.
Do you notice they didn't put his name up yet? They haven't showed his name so far.
Yeah, that might come up. I can't remember. I didn't take his name.
Political base. You can't just put people into a country and let them do it on the scene, run around from village to village and so on. We'll try and form a government because it doesn't work that way. You've got to have an off-the-peg government to go in with, and you've got to have
Love the idea of an off-the-peg government.
There you go. Organised and delivered from the top down.
Amazing.
The propaganda to go in with it, to say why people in the villages and the hills and the mountains and the plains should support this.
And Rome was rather fun, our talks in Rome.
Amory and Lowe's first job was to create what would look like an independent Albanian government in exile. They gathered the refugee leaders together in Rome.
We wanted to keep it secret. And everybody thought you were Clark Gable. And we were surrounded.
Can I just say, by the way, the notion that they wouldn't do this with something like Zelensky's government in Ukraine, as one example, is preposterous to me. I just don't understand why people don't accept that this sort of thing goes on today. Now, they're very dismissive of the idea of anything clandestine being possible, and yet they would definitely believe it of this period.
And
why is that people don't believe that things would happen today?
Yeah. This is the framing that I'm talking about when I said this is about the British establishment and its vision of itself. That you see Curtis consciously framing these guys as kind of silly old duffers in a way as well. It goes to the theme of the brilliant video you did today about culture. It's not enough just to deliver culture. You have to deliver it within framework narrative. And that's what Lowe is talking about there. You don't just say, wouldn't it be great to have a new government? You have to sort of have a scaffolding by which to implant that into a country, which will involve narrative as well. And that's what you're talking about, with Zelensky as well. There's a highly constructed narrative around him, despite what we know about 2014 and Western involvement.
I agree with what you said about Curtis. Does always portray, especially anyone who's loyal to the Empire, as silly duffers. He always does that. That's a continuing thing.
Or like a kind of Colonel Blimp character.
Kind
of stereotype.
Past it, no longer in touch with reality.
He's kind of, the footage he's chosen is very much them kind of cigars.
They are like that as well.
Yeah.
It
draws attention to that slightly ridiculous quality. I'm not saying they may not be, men of capability, but there's this element of them kind of rubbing around, sort of being very grandiose and not sort of brutally, machtpolitik about what they're doing.
The name would come up, and then no, it couldn't be because we have a blood feud. My family has a blood feud with him, and no, it can't be because he wouldn't be accepted because he's too closely identified with the royalists, or he's too closely identified with something else, and so interminable arguments. I mean, and I might add, the Albanians love talking.
Eventually, this committee was formed. Its head was Midhat Frasheri, the president of the Albanian Republican movement. His deputy was to be Abbas Kupi, the leader of the royalist faction. If the communists were brought down, then these men would be invited in as the government, and no one would ever know that Britain and America had been behind them.
Look at that. They had both sides. But they had both both parties working together. Interesting, very interesting.
Meanwhile, fighting men were selected from refugee camps in Italy, where thousands of exiled Albanians were living. At the same time, letters were sent out to ex-British soldiers from this house in Paddington. They offered a job in the Mediterranean and points east.
I received a letter from the Royal Marine Association indicating that there was a job in the Middle East that a chap with my type of training would be probably interested in, and that I responded to it, and eventually it turns out to be MI6, wasn't it?
Lofty.
Just love the ideas, let's get Lofty on the blower. It's a job for Lofty,
And for an interview with MI6. The job was landing small groups of armed men on a rocky coast at night, the very thing he had done in the war.
Did you jump at the job? Yes, it was interesting, wasn't it?
What were you doing otherwise?
I'd only just come out of the service. I'd just about finished my leave.
And what was the alternative?
Well, I'd have to go to work, wouldn't I?
Next, MI6 needed a suitable boat. 2 young Englishmen were building one in Athens.
This is the model of a Greek sailing caique, and the boat that we built was based on this. She looked exactly like a Greek sailing caique, the same rig, same hull, except underwater she was deeper. The job anyway was landing Albanian
refugees, as they were.
Putting them back into Albania with the idea of fermenting some sort of a revolution.
The boat?
Curious. Importing refugees into a place to foment a revolution. Anyway, that's a conspiracy theory, of course.
It was called the Stormy Seas. The 2 yachtsmen agreed to the job and flew to London to be briefed.
As far as I remember, that's when they made us sign the Official Secrets Act. Another thing I remember being told, whether it was then or later, must have been then I think, was that if we were unfortunate enough to be caught, we would talk. They said, therefore, the less you know, the better. Only know what you need to know, because if they get you, they'll make you talk.
The head of the American Secret Service is said to have once remarked, "Whenever we want to subvert any country, we always find that the British have an island within easy reach."
Is that what the Chagos thing was about recently?
Good point.
I have to say, this is fascinating, Simon. This one.
Yeah, and especially that pair of characters there, just as an example of what looks like a kind of amateurism. I'll only say that. There's something wonderfully camp about them as well. Just to look at the pair of them. But
well, I love that bit of him behind the mask. He looks so sneaky. That's why I made him the front cover star of this episode.
Yeah, with his cravat and his shirt and his funny sort of wavy hair. It's
just for anyone not watching, Malta was still part of the British Empire or Commonwealth at this time and had been a crucial site in the Second World War. Well, it's had a lot of history, but yeah, Malta was a British possession at this point.
This is the entrance to the fort, which normally nowadays had a drawbridge when I lived here. And the moat down here was a firing range, because this is a place where we trained the men. It was army property when we were here, and it was a long way from the flesh pots, Valletta. It was away from any town or village, and it was chosen really because it was out of the way for security reasons.
The British part of the operation was to begin in the autumn of 1949. MI6 chose this fort in Malta as the secret base. Albanian fighters were to be trained and then taken home. Their task was to create havoc. The British agent appointed as military commander was an expert in subversion. He had just 4 months.
During that time, I had about 40 Albanians in all who came to this fort and put through the training which is required to send men into a hostile country.
Well, we was training them to use small arms and also so that they could get used to boats, hopping in and out of boats, because they all lived in the mountains and boat work and things of that nature were foreign to them.
Most of these men had been in camps in Germany and Italy, and they were poor chaps. They had no country, no future, and I think they volunteered because they hoped they would be able to eventually get back to their own country.
The Marines nicknamed the Albanians the Pixies because they were so small.
They were a bit sheep-like, really. They were all displaced persons and been kicked around from Libya to Italy, and and I suppose that it was a meal ticket. they had everything to gain. And at that stage, as I say, living in DP camps, nothing to lose. And that's the basis of revolutions, isn't it?
Smiley and his wife had to live the double life of agents in the field. The cover supplied for them by...
Simon, his name is actually Smiley.
Yeah.
I thought that was the name of the Tinker Tailor guy.
That's right. Yeah, there's elements of this which it's when you see that you think, I wonder if Le Carre culled these things from people he knew, and obviously this was the time when Le Carre was in the service, the late 40s, the early 50s, exactly when this stuff was going on, and so it seems to me like any kind of author who's going to have that magpie sensibility of picking out these kinds of details. I mean, the interesting stuff he was talking about there about what he called DPs, displaced persons, this phenomenon after the war of emigres and exiles who were scattered around and not, able to return to their own countries. He uses that in Tinker Tailor. One of the central characters, Jim Prideaux, who's this spy who's being blown on an operation, and he now works at a public school. At the public school, there's a janitor called Latzi, who's described as a DP, displaced person, who's obviously someone who the Secret Services would use for kind of legwork on the ground. These kinds of guys who had an animus against, a communist takeover and would be reseeded into countries, or would, work, if you like, at low level on intelligence operations. So the displaced persons around Europe were kind of a sort of a fertile population from which to draw people who would, go in, like that chap we saw at the beginning who said we're doing it for an ideal. They had specific a real lived animus against, first of all the German occupations and then the communist occupations.
So were these guys were these guys displaced because they were
some of them had been, as he says, in refugee camps in Italy, but essentially they were sort of displaced Albanian nationals. They could have been pro-monarchist types, obviously just those who wouldn't. I mean, as we'll see with Philby here, I mean, there was an obvious danger because people were known to the communists because of what Philby did. And so this was a high risk thing, but it was also sort of natural to these people wanting to get back into their own country and take it back.
Now, sorry to interrupt proceedings with cigar talk, but do you remember I was talking about that Fonseca #1 at the start, Simon? It's now run out, which means I need a second cigar to take us through the actual doc. So I'm going to play this, but I'm going to run to get a cigar. So
yes.
Be no pausing for the next minute or so because I'm
okay.
I wanted to add something about.
Philby. Go on, Horace.
Well, just for anyone who doesn't know, Philby was recruited into he joined the Foreign Office and MI6 and other stuff. I think in the late mid to late 30s, but he was recruited by the NKVD to be a Soviet spy by about 33, I think 32, something like that. Quite a long time before this, and I don't know by what stage, but certainly by some point in the 50s, he was pretty senior.
Yes.
And by the time, I think probably before the Burgess fleeing to the Soviet Union thing, Philby was a candidate to become the head of MI6.
Yeah.
And the Soviets would have had top-down control, sort of MI6.
Yeah.
He got close to that, but then he was busted by Burgess fucking things up.
He pretty much after Cambridge, he went over to the continent and was involved around the place as a journalist in the Spanish Civil War, and in France. Before the Germans took over, he left just the day before the French surrendered, and he was picked up essentially by a lady called Litzy Friedman in Vienna in I think the mid-30s, and then when he came back to London from France, he was recruited by a guy called Arnold Deutsch, who was an NKVD officer. And it was alleged that he was made this just blunt offer because he'd been obviously a communist at Cambridge, and he was made this offer by Deutsch to join the NKVD. And he he actually wrote, he said, well, you do not hesitate to join an elite force. So he was somewhat of an elitist.
Philby was smart as well. He like it was other guys who messed up the Cambridge 5 infiltration. There may have been more than 5, by the way, but it was the other guys like Guy Burgess who just got found out or screwed things up and were careless. But Philby himself was clever, and like he got blown because of them.
You know, I remember studying Andrew Marvell. It's going to sound like a very strange segue here, right? I remember studying Andrew Marvell when I was in university, and there was always these rumors that Andrew Marvell was a Dutch double agent. Okay, but then it transpired actually that he was a British triple agent, by which he was pretending to be a double agent for the Dutch, but actually he was feeding everything back to the English, if that makes any sense. So that made him a triple agent. And I could never quite get my head around, like, what's an agent, what's a double agent, what's a triple agent, right? But there's no chance that this guy was secretly, like, only pretending to work for the Soviets. He was actually a double agent, was he?
Yeah. I mean, he talked from his earliest youth, where he spent in the Raj, essentially, of his sympathies for ordinary people. I think he said something about he spoke better Hindi than he did English, as a youth, and he was very concerned about the plight of ordinary Indians, and he carried through with this sentiment towards ordinary people, right through his Cambridge career, and then later when he started dotting around Europe. So he was all in on this stuff. I mean, the thing about Philby was essentially it was everything for the party. Even he divorced his first wife, this Litzy Friedman, simply because they told him he needed to. He had to sort of shrug off all communist associations, and so he found ways to ditch people. I think his second wife, who had mental health problems as well, unfortunately, I think for him, from his sort of point of view, she died and was out of the way. So it kind of didn't bother him. He had a strange sort of slightly narcissistic and sociopathic aspect to him as well. But he was very consciously framing himself as someone with pro-German or pro-fascist sympathies in order to distract very specifically from the fact that he was involved with the Russians.
Yeah, anything I've read about him, he was just very genuine anti-fascist. Like from as soon as the Germans, Hitler started getting close to power, I think early 30s, before 33. Just loads of people react against that by basically just becoming Soviet collaborators at some level, and in his case, actually become an agent for their intelligence services. But the idea of anti-fascism, it's hard for a lot of us to account for, but that gripped a lot of people through the 30s.
Yeah,
and I don't know if anyone's watched this book as well. It's called A Spy Among Friends. I mean, it's fictional, but it's about Nicholas Elliott, who was later sent to try and retrieve Philby when he'd sort of half fled to Beirut. And the drama is set around that. But in that, like, Philby's portrayed as seeing himself as a patriot, and he really hates being called a traitor. Obviously not a patriot of the British state exactly, or the British aristocracy, but he saw himself as not a traitor at all. in the fictional version. I don't know if that's how closely that's based on reality, but it's quite a good drama. It's got he's played by Guy Pearce, and it's quite good acting.
So no pausing for the next minute as I go and quickly grab probably a Romeo and Juliet Mille Fleur. I'll be back.
Take the label off.
MI6 was that of Deputy Commander of the Army Garrison and his lady wife.
Nobody knew what I was doing, and socially I think we built up a fairly good reputation as going to parties. Polo I really enjoyed, and we had a very interesting time because Prince Philip was here at the time in the Navy, and our present Queen was then Duchess of Edinburgh, and she was here too. And as I say, it was a very gay and social life. Very often we'd go to a dinner party in dinner jackets. We dressed up in those days. Ladies wore hats when they went out and all that nonsense. And after dinner, we'd whistle up here and start working in an office here, deciphering signals, and I probably had to answer them or act on them and so on. And so we did lead a double life in that respect.
What was your social life like in Malta?
Well, we was working, all during the week. More or less extended hours, and
I'm back, by the way, so we can pause again.
We just had one day off a week. Went into Valletta, a couple of beers, and that was about the size of it.
But one large obstacle remained. King Zog, who now lived a lonely exile in Alexandria. Without his blessing, none of the royalist guerrillas would fight.
We went on a journey to Alexandria to try to enlist the backing of King Zog, but realizing that the Republicans in Albania would be unlikely to accept his official leadership, and the Americans anyway weren't very keen on kings.
We flew down there and we went to this villa outside of Cairo where...
I just love the idea that, okay, right, Albanians, you're dealing with the British and you're dealing with the Americans. And this dude and the previous guy here, the two guys who turn up, you couldn't get two more stereotypical dudes, could you? Turning up is like kind of, you know, the only thing missing is like a top hat and, you know, maybe a big cigar for this guy, you know. It's kind of,
just the way he took that casual drag on the cigarette. There's something much more realist about him in a way.
Zog was living at that time, and then explained to Zog what we were trying to do, and to save his feelings, we told him that we didn't think it was the moment to try to put a royalist government back. They'd gone out of fashion a bit in the Balkans.
They wanted to make a kind of a free Albanian committee, which would be recognized by everybody, like the government in exile, because most of our government in exile were dead. And my husband answered, there's one thing that a king cannot do. My kingly duties and responsibilities, I cannot give over to any kind of committee or to any kind of man. And
sorry to interrupt you, but I'm pretty much convinced that there's an Iranian version of this or a Persian version of this in LA. Now, there's that large population of Persian Jews and royalists and so on who live in LA. I am pretty convinced that it's been the CIA plan since about this time here that we're watching. They've got some version of, we're going to bring the Shah back, right? It's one of like several plans they've got. And one of the quote unquote governments in exile is based in LA. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So he was very angry. He wasn't well. And he really told me that they should leave the room.
They left and allowed Zog to sleep on their proposals. They returned the next day.
Julian put it to him beautifully. I mean, Julian was just wonderful. And he said, Highness, can we depend on you not to oppose anything we're doing? Will you help us for the sake of your country? And Zog agreed. He said, yes, I won't necessarily do everything to help you, but I will do nothing to oppose what you're doing or to try and put a spanner in your works. He didn't put that in Albanian, but that's what he was saying.
Why did King Zog trust the British and the Americans then?
I don't know if he trusted, but I don't know. I think rather he hoped. After all, they were against communism, weren't they? At least they were supposed to be.
He was the only head of state, whether king, president, or what have you, who, when an assassin took a shot at him, fired back. And it happened at the Vienna Opera House, where he'd gone on a state visit to Austria. He stepped out of his carriage, and from one of the columns, or at the entrance to the Opera House, an assassin started blazing away with him with a pistol. So Zog, instead of falling mortally wounded to the ground or jumping back, fell into the gutter for cover, whipped out a pistol and started shooting back at the assassin. It's the only time in history it's ever happened that the head of state is fired back. And I thought it was terrific. Very Balkan, because obviously he wouldn't move. He wouldn't be dressed for the evening if he hadn't had his gun with him.
The military preparations went on. The stormy seas slipped into Malta.
Just so we're all thinking, big B for based there. Man, just firing back. I mean, even if I didn't like him, just firing back. Good on you. Good on you.
Yeah.
It's cool. It is cool, to be fair.
Latham and Barclay waited to be contacted.
Our telephone calls had to be made away from where we were living in a telephone box, so they couldn't be, I don't know, bugged.
Do you think Adam Curtis said to this guy, look, just be behind the mask and look sneaky? What do you think he got given directions here? So I feel like Curtis may have not had a lot to do with this documentary, Simon. Do you have any inkling as to how involved he is with this one?
Well, he's clearly not involved in doing any VO. That's being done by Ian Holm, aka Bilbo Baggins from the Lord of the Rings films.
What?
And I don't know who the interviewer is on set here. I think it's the choice of the footage and the way that he emphasizes things that he, in a standard BBC documentary, they wouldn't necessarily have dwelt on. I think it's more these odd little characters. I mean, this pair of, I don't know.
There is something very Curtis about these two, isn't there?
Yeah, something a little bit Queenie about them, that just comes across, and this, as you say, the massive boat. I mean, it's kind of a metaphor of a kind of naivety about what they're doing.
Do you say we're listening to Ian Holm or something?
Ian Holm is the main narrator. Yeah.
No idea. Yeah. That's an extra bonus.
Yeah.
And do you remember that strange man? I don't know who he is even now. But we had to meet him at the 6th milestone outside Valletta on the way to Rabat. And we got in this bus. It was a baking hot day and more or less desert, And we were counting the milestones as we went along. The 6th one, we stopped the bus and got out. And there was a man wiping the dust off the 6th milestone, you see, looking in the opposite direction, of course, when we got off the bus. So we had to look in the opposite direction too, while he walked off in the middle of the field. The bus got on the way. But the whole setup was so laughable. It was like the most stupid James Bond film. It was quite unreal.
We were playing sort of cops and robbers, really, most of the time.
On the 4th of September, the Albanian committee arrived in London. They stayed in the Berkeley Hotel. They visited the studios of the BBC World Service. Their leader, Midhat Frasheri, was given a 15-minute broadcast to Albania. It was transmitted at 4 p.m. It was never heard. Unfortunately, electricity was not switched on in Albania until 6. It was at this stage that a new figure joined the team. A rising young...
Just quite straightforward, British deep state use of the state monopoly broadcaster there, right? For Cold War propaganda. Yeah, just simple.
Star in MI6 had been promoted to the job of representing the intelligence services in Washington. He spent September 1949 being briefed about the details of the Albania operation. His name was Kim Philby. He then traveled to Washington to take up his post.
When Philby got into place and so on, it was agreed that the operational command of the operation was a joint.
Another magnificent thin moustache on this fellow. Must have been the CIA trend in that era to wear moustaches like this.
Interesting old school look, not like the sort of Brooks Brothers suits kind of guys that you see in the sort of 80s kind of things.
Well, I mean, it's now whenever you see CIA guys, they're always wearing a Hawaiian shirt for some reason, and appearing on Judge Knapp mainly. Yeah. But
they're the fun-loving intelligence service.
It seems like there was a change in the service at some point.
One shared by Philby and myself when we were together. Philby was a great charmer. He came to us with an enormous reputation, and here was a man who had very considerable experience, but in addition had something that appealed to Americans, which was that he was known as a young Turk. That is to say, he had produced a revolution within the British service in which had advanced his own career. And
the Americans liked him because he was a commie. Let's just come out and say it.
So on. And the American bureaucracy sometimes admires that kind of thing.
I've heard it said, like, this is no lie, from numerous people, that the American deep state are just straightforwardly like love commies, are communist, basically, and have been since like FDR's time, like internally. I've heard that said so many different times, but this seems to be like a yet another kind of confirmation of it. They're progressive, you know.
Yeah. This is something. I mean, clearly, but basically, Philby is the basis for the Bill Hayden character in Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy. He's a kind of like a T. Lawrence style adventurer, but mixed with a sort of boho artistic sensibility, the kind of the coruscating wit and the sort of devastating British panache, and Le Carré kind of somewhat more fictionalizes him above and beyond the actual Philby, who ended up being quite a morose character, a depressed alcoholic after his defection. But he had these elements of presentation, which, as you say, made him fascinating to Americans in the way that the British can kind of blag their way through with an air of cultivation and artistic sensibility, let's say, which is persuasive, but of course, which can conceal a multitude of sins.
What you said, AA, about a lot of American deep state guys being sort of sympathetic to communism. Obviously, there are very strong counterexamples to that, but one guy who comes to mind who is John Brennan, who's still alive now, and was head of the CIA. He at least voted for by his own admission, voted for the Communist Party, like the Communist Party of the USA, which was like crap, not even a good way to support communism. But yeah, he supported them when he was a younger man, and then became head of the CIA.
Just remarkable, isn't it?
And so he came with this enormous reputation and turned out to be, as I say, a man of very great charm. He seemed to be discreet. One had the feeling that one could have confidence in him.
The committee, Albania's government in waiting, had also traveled to America to publicize their cause. They were installed in the Lexington Hotel in New York, paid for by the CIA. But then, at the end of September, an event occurred that shocked and frightened both the British and American governments. The Soviet Union exploded their first atomic bomb.
This doesn't sound like Ian Holm, Simon.
Oh, it is. No, yeah, it's him.
It is him.
It's him, all right. Yeah.
In Washington, the foreign ministers of the 12 Atlantic...
Hitting back at the Russians was now more important than ever. Dean Acheson, the U.S. Secretary of State, met Ernest Bevin in secret after this NATO meeting. They gave the final go-ahead to the first landings. But a few days later...
I should mention Ernest Bevin. I'm sure we talked about this a couple of weeks ago. Is absolutely hero worship by all of New Labour. Like, they absolutely love the guy. Not Nye Bevin now, Ernest Bevin, the one that we saw just now. He is like the prototype of everything New Labour should be in their view. So
Nye Bevin, Ernest Bevin was a real anti-communist leftist, wasn't he?
Yeah, and the reason I bring this up is because, do you remember it was leaked when the Blairites were trying to like oust Corbyn, and they were undermining Corbyn from within, and then Starmer did his purges, right? I can't remember the name of the guy now. He's got like ginger hair and is kind of like quite fat, but he's like one of the internal Labour bruisers.
Is it Pat McFadden?
No, he's not like he's not like a cabinet ranking. He's like behind the scenes. David something. He's like he was actually attacked for being racist and all these sorts of other things by the Corbynistas, but of course, because he's a Blairite, he didn't ever get fired or anything. But this guy internally made all of the Labour MPs do a test, right? Basically like a purity test. and it was like, and there were points attached to the answers they gave, right? So, and one of the questions was Nye Bevan or Ernest Bevan, right? And if you picked Nye Bevan, it was like a demerit, like -5.
Instant fail.
If you picked Ernest Bevan, it was like +20 to your score. We should go through that test one day because it was absolutely fascinating. I'll see if Max Tempers probably has it. I'll see if he can get him to send it to me. But it's a really fascinating insight into the mind of like the Alistair Campbell types, you know, the Blairites within the party. You know,
Ernest Bevan, clearly the D4 damager figure that you need to be.
I mean, I think it's because he's a patriot. He's a hardcore on foreign policy, you know, this sort of thing. Whereas, of course, the Corbynitas are weak and pacifist and anti-nuclear and things like that. And this is one of the big splits within the Labour Party. So,
and yeah, Bevan was pro-NATO, wasn't he?
Pro-NATO, exactly.
Like,
pro-NATO,
right.
Yeah.
Also in this section, mention of Dean Acheson, the US Secretary of State, who made the famous quote, "Great Britain has lost an empire, but has not yet found a role," which is what he's known for. And if you have a look at a picture of him, he's also a slim moustache chap as well.
Do you know what the point of him saying that was?
Put us in our place.
It was because loads of people in Britain, like politicians, were still holding out against the idea of joining the European unification project, which Acheson and many other CIA guys and Rockefeller guys and Council on Foreign Relations guys were all very strongly in favour of, including the ending of sovereignty.
Later, the
So suck on that, Tom Luongo.
operation suffered a major setback.
I got a phone call from the New York City police. Said, there's a man dead in a hotel, in the Hotel Lexington here in New York. And we don't know who he is. He's got a funny passport we've never seen before. And there are 2 or 3 of, we don't know if they're his relatives or what they are, in his room, screaming in a way in a language we can't figure out what it is. See, but we found a slip of paper in his pocket that has your name and the New York telephone number. So we want you to come down here right away. So I had to go down as fast as I could. And I got in the room, and there was poor old Midhead. And he was on the bed, and he was dead as he could be. The room was in absolute chaos because these 3 Albanians, they were screaming. He told us he had gold sovereigns and they're not here in the room. You stole them. No, you stole them. You stole them. And they went on arguing and so on. In the meantime, the New York police are getting more, and they said, what do you got to do? Are you one of these Albanians too? I said, no, I'm not an Albanian. And I said, I'm with the State Department. It's the best thing to say under the circumstances. So I said, well, we got to take him away to the medical examiner's office. So I said, take him away. And then I got a hold of these guys and said, now listen, stop arguing about these sovereigns, whichever one of you took them. I couldn't care less. Here's some money to bury him with. Fortunately, I had some money with me because I didn't want him to go to Potter's Field, you know. I wanted to at least get a decent, he'd come there for us, and so probably.
Frascari had died from a massive and unexplained heart attack. The government in exile fell apart. There was now no political base to the operation. But it was too late to change anything. At exactly the same time as the would-be Albanian president lay dying in this room, a British naval motorboat had left Malta with 2 groups of Albanians on board. They were to rendezvous in secret with the stormy seas. For Britain and America, the Cold War was now no longer a political battle. They were about to invade an outpost of the Soviet Empire. The Stormy Seas was heading for the mountainous coastline of southern Albania. This is 8mm film shot secretly this year of the very place the Albanians were to land. Leatham and Barclay were now on their own. All they had to do was find the landing beach that MI6 had codenamed Seaview.
We went over by night to Albania, and pitch dark, no moon, anything like that. And it needed rather skillful navigation. I don't now remember how we picked up it was just one...
Landing beach.
Landing beach, well, there were just mountains, you know, high black mountains, jagged peaks, and you could just see ravines coming down, but as to which was the ravine we were going for. When we got in close to the shore, there was a big swell coming in, oily calm, no wind, no moon, and the swell rolling into the shore, and you could see the clouds going by overhead fast, and down low there was no wind at all.
The stormy seas lay 200 yards off the coast. The Albanians were transferred to a small boat and taken in by Marines.
When we was more or less about 200 or 300 yards off the beach, there was a light came up because it was a fairly steep to rocky terrain like Cornwall. And one of the pixies saw it, you see, as well, and pointed out, look, you know. So it was oblong, like a door. The door had opened. So of course I myself watched it for a bit, and it closed. So of course there's 1,000 thoughts in your head. You're right on the threshold, you know. And so I thought, well, probably somebody put the cat out, or stepped outside for a leak. And so we pushed on, unloaded the pixies, and went back for the others. And of course when we got back in again, they were still at the bottom of this ravine, grouped together, sort of huddled up. So I opted out and said, I went up to them and said, well, you know, because I couldn't see much point in hanging about. So they all just mooched off.
Within hours, this group was ambushed by Albanian security forces. These 3 men were killed immediately. The other group ventured into villages, only to be told that a few days before, the Albanian army had sealed off the area. Meanwhile, Smiley and his staff had moved to a large villa on the island of Corfu, 3 miles from the Albanian coast. They waited there for radio messages from the guerrillas.
They did come up, some of them. They didn't all come up on the air as quickly as we'd like, and in fact some didn't come up at all. They were obviously clobbered before they could, but those who did come up gave news that they were probably expected, because they had met opposition, which we didn't expect them to meet. We were expecting them to land and just trail over the mountains to their home areas, so to speak.
6 days later, the stormy seas landed more groups. Again, they found the hills crawling with soldiers. There was little they could do. The men began to straggle across the border to Greece.
When the first lot of men came out, they were debriefed, not by me, but they definitely said they had been, no doubt about it, they'd been expected. And I went back with the worry that there'd either been a traitor or a colossal breach of security. And when I say a traitor, I mean one of us here, a mole, as we like to call it these days. There might have been somebody here either was double-crossing us, or there'd been a bad breach of security, which I couldn't believe, because we kept security here very tight, and it worked extremely well. We'd sent these poor men literally to their deaths, and we'd let them down very badly somehow, but I didn't know how or who.
There were hurried late-night conferences at MI6 headquarters between the British and Americans. Something was going wrong. The question was whether it was just bad luck.
Well, we know now it wasn't bad luck, but at the time we didn't know. The bad luck consisted of Kim Philby. He was reading all the messages I was sending to Washington about what was happening in the operation, and also he was getting information from the British embassy side as well. And he was he was definitely trotting around to the Soviet embassy, giving him all the details. That's why they were going in the bag. But we didn't know it at that moment.
Undeterred, the next year, 1950, the Americans planned their subversion. 250 Albanian exiles were chosen and taken to a military camp near Munich. The United States Army knew them only as Company 4000, a labor battalion. The pattern was the same as for Malta. Small groups were trained, often at night, in how to bring down a government. Meanwhile, Kim Philby went about his business in Washington. Parties at his house in Nebraska Avenue soon became the center of social life for the American intelligence world.
They were long and very, very wet. And we all drank. That's not a reproach to Philby. I do understand that Philby really at certain points drank things that people simply don't drink, like, the mouthwash and so on, that kind of thing. But
What? What's he on about?
he's talking about Philby was a prolific taster and appreciator of alcohols, but this is part of actually what the Soviet model of a good infiltration agent was the KGB, the NKVD, later to be the KGB, would look for people, especially people who would hold big parties. I mean, they would look for industrialists or, politically affiliated people who would have a big social life where they could get lots of people from the political and intelligence establishment to come along, and alcohol would loosen lips, and there would be breaches of security, and so the intelligence services in that host country would be compromised. And Philby was, one of these kind of charming bon vivant characters that they used for this very purpose, and it was a model that they exploited throughout the period of the Cold War. You would see this somewhat in the sort of the James Bond novels, where the villains like Goldfinger or Drax in Moonraker are these kind of industrialists that were seeded into Britain. In order to be these kind of social hubs from which the intelligence service in Russia would draw compromise and information.
But they would, among the boozes available would be mouthwash, you're saying? Like meths. Even the wankers on the street wouldn't drink that.
I don't quite know how hard it went, but yeah, certainly Philby, as it turned out later, was was pretty keen on the sauce. And of course, Guy Burgess was a notorious alcoholic as well. And while Burgess became something of a stone in Philby's shoe when he got over to Washington, they did enjoy the odd bottle of champagne together.
Burgess died in his 50s from boozing.
Yeah,
he died. He didn't even make it to 60 because he boozed all his life, hard all the time.
Yeah.
But yeah, just if anyone in the chat can explain why this guy's talking about drinking mouthwash, just
I think it's just an American expression for any alcohol at all. When you'll take it, you'll drink anything.
Okay.
That period, we really were all afloat on a sea of drink. Everyone drank their way through the Second World War, and they had to. I mean, people in the United Kingdom were under such terrible stress that it was, and this is common to all wars and so on. The habit went on afterwards, and since Philby enjoyed it himself and so on, and we all had the habit, but at that time we were all in our 20s, and at the oldest in our early 30s, and this is part of life at that time.
Well, he had everybody fooled here, Washington, everywhere. And he certainly had me fooled, too, because never in his cups did he ever give anything away that one might have said there's something suspicious about him. Not at all.
On the night of November the 19th, 1950, the Americans began their attacks on the government of Albania. An unmarked plane flew over the north of the country. One group was dropped by parachute here in the Mati region. At daybreak, they saw soldiers combing the hills.
Edhe kimi dal me një kodër në pyjet edhe kemi zënë 4 dollinja ati. E shishna ushtrin ka dilte o kolla, edhe na automatikin e kemi parë në dorë, edhe kalëshna një ushtar, o civil, o ushtar e kalëshin për desh zoti, edhe nuk na pa. Edhe mas atyne na vetëm qe.
For 3 days and nights, the group hid under leaves in the forest. Finally, in desperation, they ventured into the village below.
Po masani e pa me dhe të vërtetën se në lemër e popli, që ju u kanë ditë se ju do të vini edhe minuti këtu. Se do të vini në minutin kur vini ju. E në ushtria a kanë në fushën e degës e lemrume, e to na prit në atë minutin që na do të zbritshëm. Po na për fat, ratëm gabimisht, ratëm në malet e Krumës, se na të kishina paron në fushë degës në vendin e caktuar, ishin të na pritët i hava, burr, me parashutët, në të qafë në to.
Pause, please.
Another group would...
Sorry, if I'm the NKVD right now, I'm thinking, tell the Albanians to act less as though they know every detail. Like, we've got a top agent inside the enemy's intelligence services to protect, you know? Don't tell them, don't give them the perfect reaction, because then it's quite obvious.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. It was so obvious that apparently they even knew the names of the guys who'd be coming ashore. I mean, all of the missions that MI6 launched pretty much ended in disaster, and the guys were killed. The CIA managed to get through about 11 different teams, and they got some of them to infiltrate into the Albanian army and the Communist Party. They did a bit of sabotage, a bit of resistance, even dropping leaflets, doing clandestine radio stuff from a boat offshore. But this was at the cusp period of 1949-50, and it was when Philby went over to be the transatlantic liaison with the CIA. That, I mean, the first missions, the MI6 ones, failed because Philby was already feeding back the information to the Russians at that stage. And it didn't affect the Americans at that point because he didn't know what they were doing. But when he went over to Washington, of course, he learned what they were doing from James Jesus Angleton. And that way, he could also feed information about American operations. So the initial burst, the Americans did okay, better than the British, but then they started to suffer as well because Philby had the goods on them.
For anyone watching who doesn't know, until Philby was exposed, I'm not sure at what stage the Americans considered him sort of burnt, and obviously one with the enemy. But until then, there was a very good relationship between British and American intelligence, especially in the persons of Philby and Angleton, who were like not just closely collaborating for a long time, but were like best friends as well. Personal trust that obviously Philby betrayed. And then Angleton, I think, who had become pretty senior in the CIA, then sort of led an anti-British turn because of the damage Philby had done, and probably emotional reasons as well.
Yeah, it was about 1955 the Americans actually gave up, but it was everything between 1949 and 51. Philby blew all the operations, so it wasn't going to go anywhere. The Italians were also in there, and they took in. They were sort of reasonably successful in a way. They took in a team of 8 guys who literally took on 450 Albanian soldiers, and the Albanians killed 4 of them, but 4 of them managed to get away. And later on, they were faced with about 600 Albanian troops. And remarkably, even out of that, 2 of them managed to get away. But there was a lot of people being, betrayed, and then they would go to trial, have a confession, and, then they'd be shot or hung.
Well, to those 8 men, they salute.
Mm-hmm.
Drop further south in the Martinesh region.
Kom hecë unë ja 10 hapa, po hecëm keqë, ishem ranë, kishem municion shumë. Tu hecën, veç kur ka keq pushka. E u kanë vika ata, u binju dhe versantave bre. Mu, s'ka shku e gjatë, më ka rani pushka. Më kom në majtë, edhe më ka groni sakë të unë ja, unë kishem me thënë ja 5 metre, po këdi ma pak nështë, 3 metre, 4 metre, më ka fuqë. Po më ka fuqë për para.
This guy looks a little bit like, in like The Godfather or any of those old gangster films, when they go and like the family is all having spaghetti or something.
Yeah.
Like one of the family members in the background. Like
one of the retainers, yeah.
Yeah. exactly.
Or it's just a hitman, maybe, or like a Luca Brasi character.
Yeah, exactly. He looks like a Luca. Yeah, but in a more like it's like his hood days are behind him, so he's just kind of he's eating spaghetti with the family now.
I know the character you mean. There's one in the Godfather film, isn't he? He has the famous speech about, you know, you have to have this kind of thing where we all kill each other to get the bad blood out of the way. You know, it happens, and he's the one who gives Michael Corleone the gun, you know, to shoot the police officer.
What's his name? It's Clemenza. Peter Clemenza.
Yeah.
I knew it was you, Clemenza.
Edhe kur kom skje pa hiç kom gjallint. Dhe son zën kama. Kur shikoj gjaki shkonte krua.
Atë ditë kemi luftuar edhe nesër kom shkuar te shtëpia. Te shtëpia jeme natën kom shkuar. Edhe kom takuar nanën. Nana më tha gjithë ke lip këtu. Tha ke gabuar shumë që ke ardhur. Se kam edhe 4 djem tjerë.
Sorry to go off on a tangent, but there's a whole subplot in The Godfather that is incredibly badly explained with Clemenza, and there's another guy. There's like a fat one and a thin one. And like one of them's betrayed Michael.
Tessio.
Tessio and Clemenza. It's so
The
badly
tall, thin
explained.
one.
It's just like, what? Like,
Yeah, in the book it all makes sense, yeah.
but in the film, it's just like,
Yeah, it's
they all-
really
yeah,
brushed
what
over.
was you? What? When I was a kid, I watched it a lot, and I never could make sense of it. And then I think one day the penny dropped, but it's really obscure in the film. So
The film leaves it kind of mystical. Like, he says, the one who approaches you will be the one who betrays you. Yeah, but why? Why? You know, that's how you'll detect who's the traitor.
Have I told my Godfather Barzini story? I don't know if you
no,
remember.
go on.
I used to run a medical practice, and we once treated a guy, and his name was Barzini, and you know, in the Godfather books, there's one of the 5 families is led by a guy called Barzini. We thought it was
The
just
main
a
enemy
coincidence.
as well, isn't he?
Yeah, we thought this was just a coincidence, and the doctor I worked for got talking to him, and it turned out he'd been a friend of Mario Puzo. He was the Barzini on whom it was based, and
Wow.
the reason why he's in the book as a villain was basically they had a falling out over a girl, him and Puzo, so he got made into a bastard in the book. He's one of your classic Italian guys, you know, smoking the medallions and all that kind of stuff, just a kind of an old, you know, reprobate kind of character. But yeah, he was he was one of the guys. Kind of strange. Nice chap.
Barzini all along.
Yeah.
Ashtë 4 le shkojnë na. Unë I 4, ato 3 le shkojnë edhe unë. Tha orë birë, tha, ma si ke hinë kësoj rrugë, tha fishekin e mram, tha rruje edhe birë I vetë, stik e I gjallë mos bjendojë.
Night after night, the Americans flew a plane over Albania waiting for radio messages from the groups, but none came. The British had also run more groups in from Malta. News of their fate began to filter back.
2 of the members of a group of, I think, either 4 or 5, had been caught in Korcha, which is in the southern half of the country, and that, as an example, they were tied behind a car and driven through the streets until they died.
And then, on May the 25th, 1951, 2 British traitors, Guy Burgess and Donald Maclean, defected to Moscow. Philby was immediately recalled to London under suspicion of being the 3rd man who had helped them escape. But despite this, the Americans persisted. A month later, this group was dropped into the Lochnia region in northern Albania.
I remember where we said goodbye to that friends that day in 1951. So they go over the mission. And we hear after 4 months they was dropped in Albania. And after that we hear that they was killed, all of them. Every one of them was, they fight as 5 or 6 or 8 hours, I don't know, until they have an army. anything left to fight in. And after that, they burned themselves. They burned the house and themselves inside.
They burned themselves to
That's
death?
right, yeah, to death. 4 of them.
Why did they do that?
They don't want to be caught by the communists alive.
What would have happened to them if they had been captured?
They're going to be killed anyway.
If they were dropped, they were practically waiting with a net to pick them up. Or if they went in by sea, they were hiding behind sand dunes or trees. I mean, the moment they got ashore, or the moment their feet touched the ground, there were Albanian security people waiting for them. And it was, we were convinced about the leak. There was no question. Who it was another matter, but at that moment. But it had to be a leak because they couldn't be that lucky, the Albanian security people, that lucky all the time. Once in a while it might have been by chance or whatnot, but all the missions we were sending in being picked up, it was too much. It just had to be a leak.
It was to get worse. In October, Radio Tirana began to broadcast from this cinema a mass trial of captured guerrillas. The government showed photographs of their equipment, their guns, explosive devices, codes, and even American tinned food. To the world outside at the time, it sounded like any other communist show trial, full of hysterical allegations of secret American attempts to subvert Albania. But it was all true. The whole basis of the operation had been blown. Even while the trial was actually in progress, another group was dropped here. Within hours, they were surrounded by soldiers with machine guns and mortars.
I think by this stage, they may well have decided that the liberation of Albania was not on, but that there were other compelling reasons for continuing. It was important.
Something about this guy's physiognomy I don't like, guys. I don't know what it is, but is it the chin? Is it the... I just remember reading those, but do you remember that book on physiognomy? That is like, untrustworthy chin, kind of imbecile. There's something about him. It's not right.
It's a sort of porcine Tory boy features.
Exactly. He probably enjoys being whipped or something,
Yeah.
To be seen to be retaliating against Stalin's aggressive moves in Czechoslovakia, in Berlin, in Greece. But then, of course, the original objective, liberation of Albania, was lost sight of. And the Albanian volunteers who'd been led to believe that Britain and the United States were trying to help them to liberate their country were to that extent deceived.
The camp at Malta was closed down. The British had pulled out. But the Americans refused to give in. They had yet another plan to bring down the Hoxha regime. The key was King Zog. In August 1951, Zog flew to New York. He bought this estate on Long Island, reputedly with a bucket of jewels. Today, it is a ruin. In fact, the CIA paid for the estate. In return, they wanted the reluctant Zog's cooperation. They outlined a plan. An agent within Albania had brought news that a group of senior army officers were ready to move against the communist regime. All they wanted was a sign that the Americans would support them. The CIA asked Zog to allow some of his bodyguard to be sent secretly into Albania to contact the officers. Reluctantly, he agreed.
They each got a bag of gold. So it wasn't Americans, it was the king himself. And the king told me, I'm afraid I'll never see them again.
Zog sent 4 of his closest aides. Amongst them was Captain Zenel, who had been Queen Geraldine's bodyguard since the wedding. They were taken secretly from Alexandria to Paris, where they stayed in this hotel. Then, one night, a car driven by an American agent picked them up. They were driven across the border to Germany and flown from there to Greece. All hopes now rested with these 4 men. For 3 years, group after group had been captured or killed. This was a last desperate attempt to bring down the regime. It just had to work. On April the 27th, 1952, the 4 officers crossed the border into Albania. Zog's Royal Guard was returning home.
Reassuring messages came from Albania to the Americans that everything was going well. They were recruiting agents, they were storing equipment, and they were getting ready to recruit more officers and eventually rise up and throw out the communists. So reinforcements were sent in, more agents, equipment was dropped. This went on for more than a year. And then suddenly there was this bombshell at the end of 1953 when the radio announced that all these people were under arrest, indeed that most of them had been under arrest for many months, that all the messages had been intercepted and sent under communist control, and that the whole thing indeed was a plant, and that was the end of it all.
Their show trial was also broadcast. The royal household listened in Alexandria.
And then Zenel spoke. We heard his voice. And at the end of it, what he said, he called out, "I am forced," and then it was finished. So everything he said had been forced. And then they killed him. They were all killed. And the families who had taken them in. That's why it was a very tragic, horrible story. It was unnecessary. I think that if men go and sacrifice their lives, at least it should be, if it's a failure, but it shouldn't mean the death of so many other people. And a failure by betrayal is one of the most catastrophic things that can happen. They were betrayed.
Pause. Just to say, yeah, the US had quite serious intentions at the time. They had a weapons depot in Athens with guns for about 4,000 guys. And one of the sort of problems was the guys in the CIA organizing all this stuff. There's a couple of guys, one called James McCarger and another one called Edmund Michael Burke. They just were just very inexperienced planners. They didn't really have a clue about how to run these sorts of operations. As I said earlier, there was a training camp in Germany, but that got very quickly infiltrated by the Albanian security service, the Sigarimi. And part of this, again, it goes back to the culture video today. One of the reasons they didn't kind of consolidate things was, apart from Philby blowing everything, is it was a somewhat incomplete strategy. They did have a plan for economic warfare as well, doing sabotage on industry, counterfeiting currency and coupons, trying to hit Albania's export base, which, was supplying the Soviets with things like truck parts, tractor parts and stuff like that. And they just dismissed doing that kind of sort of long-term subversion and penetration, which, may or may not have made some kind of a difference. But overall, I think, these plans largely failed because they just simply thought they could put men in there who would be able to, get traction and take over by military violence, which of course wasn't going to succeed.
Could you ever forgive a man who betrayed that many people?
No, I certainly will not forgive that Philby man. Isn't he dead? He's still alive? Who died? Are the other ones?
I'd say, technically, in the business, he was tremendous. I mean, considering he was a double agent, a brilliant double agent. You can't deny that. Look what he did. If I were in Moscow and ran into him in the street outside the Inn Tourist Hotel or something, which isn't very likely that I'll be there, and he passed me, I wouldn't resist the temptation to say, hello, Kim. I wouldn't say, you son of a bitch. I'd say, how do you like living in Moscow? Strange thing, you know. I mean, morally, as I say, traitor. So, not for me. No admiration that way. But technically...
It's a bit like my admiration for Tony Blair, guys.
Mm.
You know, he's like, okay, his football manager spy card is pretty, like, he's got 20 out of 20 and a lot of stats, this Philby, right? He's just on the side of evil. Basically, that's what he's saying, isn't it?
Mm.
I was going to say
Philby
got quite a few people killed at various junctures before and after this. Various people who obviously had no idea that the Soviet spy was high up in British intelligence, and with us vulnerable to him, he would betray people who he found out to be defectors from the Soviets back to the Soviets, who would then kidnap them and torture and kill them. So he caused a lot of death.
Yeah, but I mean, he's working for his side, isn't he?
Mm-hmm.
It's just his side.
Sure,
was team evil, you know.
This was a separate comment to yours. Like, obviously, he had good attributes as a spy. He knew what he was doing.
Amazing that he could have infiltrated the way he did for the people he was working for. Absolutely amazing. I mean, he must be the shining example of the KGB school. See what you can do if you try.
Thinking about it, he's the reverse Yuri Bezmenov, isn't he?
Mm.
Because didn't Bezmenov defect the other way?
Yeah.
Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
2 years later, Philby was publicly accused of being the third man.
On the right holds a press conference to deny charges that he was involved in the disappearance of Burgess and McLean.
Well, if there was a third man, were you in fact the third man?
No, I was not.
You think there was one?
No comment.
In 1963, Philby fled to Moscow. Since then, successive governments have always denied that the Albania operation took place. Philby's role made it too embarrassing. But there are still those who thought it was the right thing to do at the time.
In the second place,
it was an exciting business, and we expected it to be exciting. It was interesting. And it was meant to be, you know, we thought it was worthwhile. It was, I mean, if it had gone right, you could say we would have liberated another country, or helped to, from an oppressor, because Hoxha still is, I suppose, is a very oppressive regime. Whether, in retrospect, King Zog would have been any better, we don't know. At that time, we thought he would. Yeah. It's a continuation of what we've been doing during the war, after all. And then everybody thought it was all right.
Now, we're not entitled to go around the world abolishing tyrannies, but when those tyrannies impinge on our own interests and our own future, then we have to defend ourselves. This was the case of the Germans. It then became the case of the Russians, but the Russian approach has been going on for centuries, and we're now face to face with it all over the world.
Some curious comments there. Were you sniggering at that, Simon?
Yeah, it's just a verbal sleight of hand of, when he's basically, as we all know, countries just have enduring interests. But the way he says, and when other countries are impinging, we have to defend ourselves. It's not we have to go and attack them, which is essentially what we're talking about here. It's them essentially attacking us.
It's always this curious duality with defense and attack in this. Mearsheimer calls it offensive realism, of course. But yes, it is a curious framing, isn't it?
I think it's because it's insalubrious for people to admit in public that we are kind of carnivorous societies who will go after resources in just the same way that the other guys on the other side will go after resources. But it's a bad look to look like you're going in there for minerals or oil or whatever, and you should actually say, well, yeah, we are doing that. because
he's basically evincing what is called the realist school in international relations here, right? As in, expects people to be acquisitive, resource oriented, power oriented, right? I noticed that what he said was that we don't go around just trying to take out every dictatorship, or I can't remember what term he used, but we don't just go after everyone who's got an oppressive government. We judge it on the basis of interest. That's sort of, there was this clash in the 60s, 70s over neocons versus realists. Do you know about this? Like in America, especially. And Kissinger was the realist school. And
that's right.
The neocons found him far too weak or unadventurous or worse, right? Because they want to use the pretext of just dictatorship itself. And it is just a pretext because they support various dictatorships, but the idea of that is what we do. We go around and we just spread democracy by just destroying any dictatorship we want. It is selective though, because they support Saudi Arabia, for instance. So
and curious figure that we've discussed a number of times on this show so far. Tone, right? During his time in charge, he wanted to invade now, Iraq style, Zimbabwe, right, on the pretext that Mugabe was a dictator, right? And the Americans, the neocons, George Bush and all them, didn't want to go for it. Not for want of Tone trying, right? So when I've talked before about there's never been a country that he didn't want to bomb, I mean, he was pushing. He wanted, even in interviews now, he's like, we should never have pulled out of Afghanistan. Should have finished the job in Iraq. Should have started the war in Iran. He's all in on the Syria thing. Because I guess in his view, the more places you invade, the more control you get. So he is basically like a neo-colonialist, I guess you'd call it, or imperialist. He's just using quote unquote dictatorship as a means to expand places that you wouldn't get access to. Why he wants Zimbabwe, I'll never know, but you know what I mean, right? So
like a neo-imperialist mixed with the human rights leftism sort of thing, like a leftist imperialist.
But the left, the human rights the human rights thing for Blair is clearly a smokescreen for the imperial ambition, because we've seen in other cases where he's perfectly willing to work with African dictators and whatnot. And just, there's that famous clip of him sitting there and the Guardian journalist is trying to draw him on. I can't remember the African woman he's sitting next to. I think it was the woman from Ghana. And the journalist is trying to draw him to comment on LGBT and gay marriage in that country. And he's like, I'm not going to do it, because he's sitting there as the advisor to that government. So it's kind of it's a weird thing. It's obvious that he's non-ideological about those things, when there's another interest at play, but he's willing to use it as a pretext, as a casus belli, if you want, to bomb.
I agree that it always has been that, the human rights sort of perspective. It has always been mainly a pretext, not necessarily sincere. However, as you mentioned Zimbabwe, I presume his stance on white Rhodesia in the 70s and 80s would have been against it, right? And therefore effectively in favour of the communists that took over, who were the main...
Presumably, yeah.
Yeah. And then when it comes to it, when they're in power after that, it's like, right, let's just get rid of them as well.
This is going back to AA's earlier comments about the sort of American sneaking regard for communists. It's this thing about neocons having this kind of ideological lineage that's descended of radical Trotskyist impulses to go in and change places.
Yeah.
And even now, I believe that the neocons are more ideological than somebody like Blair. Even though Blair is, quote unquote, a neocon, he's in it for the imperialism. Whereas some of those neocons are actually, when push comes to shove, ideological. And this has actually been shown by the Trump admin now, because some of them are very committed to Project Ukraine, as Duran call it. Whereas there are other types of neo-neocons who are just we're all in on Israel, basically. Whereas the actual neocons, the old-fashioned ones, are like, oh, we're not sure this is what they're doing in Israel is not that democratic, is it? They would probably prefer to just like replace Netanyahu and like defend Ukraine in the name of like the quote-unquote free world or something like this,
Neoconservatism, why we still need it. If only somebody had written a book with that title. Yeah.
I'm not.
Was that Douglas Murray?
Oh, heaven forfend.
That's his book from about 20 years ago now, isn't it?
Yeah, which is artfully concealed now.
Well, yeah, it's not hidden though, is it? I mean, he doesn't disavow it or anything, and I'm sure he still believes that.
No, he still argues for stuff like the Ukraine war. And,
I think recently in his encounters, though, he'd kind of poo-pooed a sort of, oh, that's not what neoconservatism means kind of approach to things. There's always a sort of definitional vagary and shift when people are coated on these things.
I do.
Douglas is all in Israel anyway. So anyway, go on, Horace.
Well, I do doubt that neocons are genuinely ideological. I would question that, because I think it really is for almost all of them. Douglas Murray might be different. He might think that he's working to some higher purpose, but people like Richard Pearl, Paul Wolfowitz, I think they may, to some extent, deceive themselves that they're acting in favour of democracy and human rights and whatever. But I think no, it's the fact that they just happen to come down against all the enemies of Israel is significant. I think that is the main story, and there may be literally self-deceit in their own minds, but it is mainly about Israeli power.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the theme of a lot of this, where I've been relating it to Jean le Carré and Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, because the whole sort of premise of those books based on this sort of stuff, it is about betrayal and deception, which essentially leads also to self-deception at some point. That's a kind of meta narrative of what le Carré really talks about, especially in his character of Smiley, where Smiley realizes that he has had to eventually win over the Soviet arch rival spy by using the same Soviet methods of essentially blackmail and pressure, and in the end it's a kind of sense of feeling dirty and compromised, in that way that we like to pose or postulate the secret services. I mean, he gives a speech to his Philby character in his book saying the secret services are kind of the true expression of a nation's character. And as we see from this show, again, there's a lot of self-deception about our own capabilities in that respect, as shown by these operations in the kind of fading the twilight of imperial competence. So I think that comes out as a theme, that, and le Carré writes the book in a way as a deception in itself. That we read that and we think we've got an in on the real spy world, but as he himself, he invented all this jargon and all of these kind of contexts in which the characters are sort of, well, we know in the book that they think they're competent, but they're deceived by the mole within who's betraying them. And we kind of read the books in a similar way, thinking that, we attribute this kind of wizened, sagacious quality to these characters. But actually we are perhaps kind of fooling ourselves. And this is Adam Curtis's view as well with this film, that, he talked about le Carré's made up world and how le Carré sort of powerfully reinforced the sort of, the gritty and realistic image of the secret services. But he said the reality was also mediocrity. Ex-colonial policemen mingling with failed academics, failed lawyers, failed missionaries, and failed debutantes. And that was le Carré himself talking, and which Curtis quotes on his blog about the Secret Service. So there was an awareness that there was a kind of imperial folly in this period, which overrated the ability to actually organize these kinds of things, which obviously the CIA continued to do. And indeed, the CIA learned from the mistakes of this to go on to Guatemala in 1954. And as we saw in Century of the Self, they displaced Colonel Arbenz, the United Fruit Company, the Banana Republic thing. But Curtis, I think, is quite down on the spies here. I mean, he tells a funny story on his blog. He says it was when he said it was revealed, it was recently revealed back in the 1970s, at the height of the obsession with traitors, that MI5 trained a specially bred group of gerbils to detect spies. Gerbils have a very acute sense of smell, and they were used in interrogations to tell whether suspects were releasing adrenaline, because that would show they were under stress and lying. Then they tried the gerbils to see if they could detect terrorists who were about to carry a bomb on a plane. But the gerbils got confused because they couldn't tell the difference between the terrorists and ordinary people who were just frightened of flying, who were also pumping out adrenaline in their sweat. So the gerbils failed as well. And he rounds off saying, perhaps MI5 shouldn't have given up so easily. Maybe what we need is a better class of gerbil to find out the truth. But maybe we have them already. They're called journalists.
Okay, all right. Well, there's a little bit left of this.
Att det przemyśliło att popul pre komunizmit na dishimi se kemi englest American mrapa. Po en realitet kan ik aanval zeggen. Nee, na pan pachu vetem se per boeien. Vetem se per ni propaganda.
I don't justify the Albanian operation or any of these other things on the grounds that the Russians are communists. I justify it on the grounds that the Russian state is a menace to the peace of the world.
And the Albania operation was one battle in that long fight?
An episode. An episode in the long fight.
An unhappy episode or a happy episode?
There is no happiness or unhappiness in foreign relations.
I feel very...
So sorry to pause again, but that guy that we were just listening to, did you ever play the game Guess Who? Did you ever play that game?
What, like where you ask questions about somebody?
He would have been just phenomenal Guess Who character, wouldn't he? You know, it's just kind of... He actually looks like one of them.
He does look like one of them. It's that hairstyle, isn't it?
An unhappy episode or a happy episode?
There is no happiness or unhappiness in foreign relations.
Pause.
I feel very...
When you're playing Guess Who, obviously one of the first things you ask is, are they a gerbil?
Well, you know, one of my claims to fame is that I could play mental Guess Who with my cousin. So we didn't actually need the ball. We could just do it in our heads. It's not quite Aleister Crowley playing 2 games of chess at the same time, just in his head, which he could do. And apparently a lot of chess masters can do that as well. But, you know, it's better than nothing. I can play mental Guess Who. I could play mental Guess Who. And we'd made up backstories for each of them as well. Like, you know, Eric owned a boat, I seem to recall, and Anita wet the bed.
Sad, to be quite frank. I think, I mean, looking back on it, knowing the result, it's just heartbreaking. I can't think any sort of words to describe it, really, but I mean, if you were in a responsible position and you were sending men, you didn't know it then, but literally sending men to their deaths, it's a pretty horrible feeling, to say the least, in retrospect.
Tell me, looking back at the operation all those years ago, well, what do you think about what happened? What do you feel about it?
Well, too bad.
Brutal.
My gosh. Well, that was really interesting. Very interesting one. And it was Ian Holmes, as you said.
Yeah. So, might pause.
Oh, just sorry, from the chat, that guy has been likened, apart from Guess Who, he's been likened to the banker in Dog Day Afternoon. The boss.
Yeah, that's true, yes.
And also Frank Pentangeli from The Godfather Part 2. Frankie Bad Angels.
You know, in Dog Day Afternoon, right? Am I remembering this correctly? But is Al Pacino's character in that? He's trying to do a bank heist to raise money for his boyfriend to get a sex change. Is that right?
Yeah,
his wife,
that's
you
right.
mean? His wife?
Yeah,
his wife. Sorry, right.
For the John Cazale character, yeah.
Now,
No. John Cazale. No.
John Cazale is his.
Oh
mate.
no, sorry, no, it's not, isn't it? Yes, he's got his boyfriend at home, hasn't he?
It's another guy. So whoever it is, he's never been in other films, but he acts excellent. It's a really good performance.
Has the Rainbow Committee got hold of that and like held it up as an LGBT classic, or is it
should be LGBT film festivals and stuff?
Or is it problematic?
They'll say Al Pacino did nothing wrong.
Yeah, it's a complicated one because it portrays a trans character sympathetically, but it also portrays the trans sympathetic character as a violent criminal.
Al Pacino is the trans ally in the film, although it ends badly.
He's a criminal. Yeah.
It's a weird through line in Al Pacino's career, really, because he did Cruising as well.
Oh yes.
And then years later, he did the TV series Angels in America.
Yeah.
And as far as I know, Al Pacino is straight, isn't he?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Just
Al
curious.
Pacino also like a fan of brown sugar, like De Niro is?
I don't know.
I think he is, isn't he?
I don't know. Al Pacino's girlfriends. I know he famously never got married. I remember that because I used to say I remember I read I was a massive fan of Pacino, and I read in a magazine once, like an interview, marriage is a state of mind, not a contract. I was like, I used to say that to my girlfriend: marriage is a state of mind, not a contract.
Living together is something you do. Being married is something you are. To quote Dubstar.
Yeah. He does seem to have a 29-year-old. He is 82 years old, Al Pacino.
He's got a 29-year-old girlfriend.
He's got a 29-year-old girlfriend who I think is Arabic.
Right.
Her name's Noor. Yeah. That's an Arabic name, isn't it?
Yeah.
So there's Big Al at 82 years old, and there's his current girlfriend.
Good on him.
Oh, good.
Wow.
What do you got?
Look how old he is. Bloody hell.
I'm happy for him and potentially for her.
Do you think he still got it? I always remember his advice in that film where he's blind. What's that film where he's blind?
Scent of a Woman.
He just says, "Oh, look, just go down on her." Do you remember? I want to get to Adam Curtis in the.
Thank you.
Hold on, in the credits. Where is he?
Yeah.
Where's Curtis?
You come back.
Is he there? He may be sort of like producer in some of these, actually, rather than.
He's not mentioned.
Director.
What does rostrum mean? What's that?
I don't know.
Rostrum camera, and they people do the titles. So when you sort of have the titles, transparencies running along the screen, the rostrum camera guy is the guy who's filming it on a special kind of podium. That's how they used to do titles. They were just transparencies that were filmed by a camera.
Okay.
There was another Al Pacino film. I think it was a Tarantino movie. Correct me if I'm not. Was it where he plays a Jewish Hollywood producer who anglicizes his name and keeps the fact that he's Jewish hidden? Am I remembering that correctly? What film was that?
Can't remember.
Was that in Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with Brad Pitt? That was a brilliant film.
Yes.
Was Pacino in that?
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, I think it is him. Yeah. I think that's the character. Yeah, which is a great film. For anybody who hasn't watched it, do go away and watch it.
Based film. Surprisingly.
The one from about 8 or 10 years ago, is that?
Yeah.
It's where it's Brad Pitt and Leonardo DiCaprio. And
you're saying it's really good.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the film where he randomly beats up Bruce Lee, and
that's right. Yeah.
It's all about the Manson, they're a bunch of commie hippies, and they just go and shoot the shit out of that. It's an amazing film. I love that film.
Yeah, it's great comment. It's a great relationship between the two characters as well. DiCaprio, the kind of sort of fading TV cowboy star who's looking to sort of boost his career by going off to Italy and making slightly iffy movies, and Brad Pitt as his stunt double, and they have this quite very moving relationship actually. And the Brad Pitt character is very, very cool, as you say. He beats up Bruce Lee.
I'm just discovering now Pacino was going out with this bitch here who says she broke up with him because he's old and miserly. On your bike, glove? No, straight in. Pacino not messing around at all. straight in with Nor, out with the old, in with the new.
Yeah.
Marriage is just a state of mind. Anyway. Just before we get to the super chats today, Max Tempers did send me the purity test that the Blairites gave to the Corbynites.
And who was it?
It was a guy called Akehurst, right?
Ah, right.
Okay.
Luke Akehurst, you were talking about.
Yeah, Luke Akehurst, right? Now, this guy Akehurst gave this test to Labour politicians and gave them a scorecard. And if they scored lowly, they were for the Starmer purge, right? Are you a supporter of Trident, nuclear power, and the state of Israel? 10 points for each of those, right? Are you or have you ever been a member of the CND, Compass, the CPLPD, the Campaign Group, Liberty, the Liberal Party, PSC, or LMAC? Minus 5 points for each yes. Okay. Did you vote for Ben or Healy in the 1981 deputy leadership? 10 points for Healy, 5 points for abstaining, minus 20 for Ben.
Wow.
If you had been a Labour MP in the 1963 leadership election, would you have voted for George Brown, Harold Wilson, or Jim Callaghan? 10 points for Brown, 8 points for Callaghan, minus 5 for Wilson. Did you think the good guys in the Vietnam War were A, the communist Viet Cong led by a Stalinist dictator Ho Chi Minh, or B, the US Marine Corps led by left-wing Democrat LBJ and JFK? 20 points for anyone unlikely enough to be saying B. Right.
Oh, wow.
Question 6. In which year did you first publicly call for the expulsion of Militant from Labour? 2 points for every year prior to 1985. Who made the greater contribution to the history of the Labour Party? Nye Bevan or Ernie Bevan? 20 points if you said Ernie Bevan. Did you support the British involvement in the following conflicts? Falklands, 1 point. Gulf War, 4 points. Sierra Leone, 1 point. Kosovo, 3 points. Afghanistan, 3 points. Iraq War.
The closer to Israel, the more points you get, right?
I mean, so that is the internal Tony Blair purity spiral test. So
It's true what Max Temper says there, that Akehurst is a massive Blairite, but that's not really, like, he's not got any, I don't think he's got any official position in the Labour Party. He might have had.
He's like a background bully, I think.
And he's like the main activist for BICOM, the British Israel Communications something. It's like proper Zionist stuff. I mean, just a traitor, like just loyal to Israel and just whatever's good for Israel.
It's completely in keeping with our theme today, not having an official position. I mean, this is again Philby, and going back to Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, the traitor in that says, at one point he's asked, why didn't you go to be head of the Secret Service? And he says, oh, no. I would have just got tied up in Whitehall meetings, better to slipstream behind the guy who's actually running it and cause havoc that way.
Akehurst has been accused of being a racist. He's been accused for comments he's made about Labour people, left-wing Labour people. He's been accused of being an anti-Semite for a rant he went on against quote-unquote left-wing Jews. He is quite the character, but hardcore Zionist, as you say. So, yeah. So that is...
If anyone ever saw that Al Jazeera documentary, The Lobby, the one that's banned from YouTube, he's briefly in that. But I was following that at Labour anti-Semitism scandal, so-called, all through it from when Corbyn got elected. And Akehurst was at the centre of things again and again and again. Yeah, and he's like an irregular in some ways.
Yeah, he is also a bit of a sloppy pig, unfortunately, as well. If you have a look at Luke Akehurst, you have a look at the picture. You have a look. I mean, let me just show you the pictures of him. He is a fat, sloppy pig. Right there, he is. Look, stain on his jumper. Hasn't even bothered to brush it up. There he is. His beloved. This is him. Look. He is apparently quite a piece of work in the background. So
he's of Gentile descent as well, but he's like was adopted, I think, by Zionist, at least by Jews anyway. He's like a sort of an adopted member of the tribe in a way. But I noticed that questionnaire gave you lots of points if you supported George Brown in the 63 leadership election.
I wondered
and
about
you
that.
lost points if you supported Harold Wilson.
Yes.
Harold Wilson was extremely pro-Israel. So I don't know what that's about. Weird.
To the left of the party. You've got to remember, like, these guys are essentially the quote-unquote far right of the Labour Party. The Blairite faction are the right wing of the Labour Party, if you want to put it that way. And what he's trying to do there, I mean, can you imagine, though, Angela Rayner sitting down and taking that test? She would have had to look up half the names. She wouldn't be able to do it, would she? You know, as if
even
modern,
I
mean, as if the modern Labour politician knows who George Brown is, or even Harold Wilson, for that matter.
So you're saying Zara Sultana wouldn't be able to...
I think Zara Sultana would struggle with that test. She wouldn't even know who Nye Bevan was, let alone any Bevan.
I think George Brown was a notorious alcoholic as well. I mean, there's a little clip of him. We saw him in the Mayfair set where he's asked by the people outside Number 10, what have you been discussing? I've been discussing the affairs of the nation. You know, but yeah.
He was known as a big boozer.
So anyway, that guy, by the way, that Luke Akers is absolutely despised on the kind of Navarra media left, if you put it that way.
Left.
I mean, he's been called all sorts of things, fascist and all sorts. So
I mean, I'm no Corbynist, but I hate him because the Corbyn Navarra thing is more what I think the Labour Party kind of is at heart, and Akehurst is like, I don't know, it's like a leftist containment agent. You know what I mean? It's, you know, drawing everything back to the centre.
So another of these power realists.
I mean, the entirety of the Blair project, if you want to put it that way, is to make Labour not Labour. Basically, I mean, that's its entire raison d'etre, and to be like, truly, this is the progressive thing to do, to just not be Labour in any single way, because if you become Labour, then you lose elections. So
just yesterday, I saw that John McTernan guy for the first time in ages on Twitter, and he is the epitome of that. It's just it's just blunt war against the soul of the party, really, like the socialist soul of the party. It's just open warfare against that for the sake of the centre ground.
Just to end cap off, just with a few facts, just before we go to super chats about Philby, he was very unhappy after he defected when he went to Moscow, and he descended into alcoholism. Essentially, he was very disillusioned with the reality of what communism was actually like, and he moaned a lot about how can they let old people live like this? These were the people who fought in the war for the Soviets, and even the old KGB guys I saw interviewed about him said, yeah, he was just a romantic, really, Philby. You know, he never quite mastered Russian, and he sort of longed to have things like marmalade and whiskey and, you know, Leon Perrin's sauce. He kind of missed all these things. He used to read The Independent and stuff like that. And interestingly, his granddaughter Charlotte Philby, she wrote for The Independent and The Guardian and New Statesman, and she and her husband run a sort of arts venue in Bristol, of course, and they host exhibitions. And of course, the first exhibition they hosted was one led by donkeys. So she's continuing in the Philby tradition of gross subversion.
May be relevant, but Kim Philby's father was like a major Orientalist, I think, but like pro-Islamic one. I think he may have even
married an Arab slave girl.
Fucking hell.
Yeah.
I think he kind of made a show of having sort of converted to Islam. I don't know whether that was for real or what.
Yeah.
We still talk about Al Pacino.
Noor Philby.
Yeah. So anyway, that was very interesting today. There have been a couple of super chats. Port Film Co-op says accent challenge for Simon. African wine critic.
Oh God. Liking this particular little number, it a cheeky little rosé from the south side of the supermarket. That's really a copy of John Bird doing Idi Amin, to be honest. If you go and seek out his collected broadcasts of Idi Amin, he sounds quite like that.
Tom says communist more based than Farage and Trump. Well, certainly more nationalist than either of them.
No jazz.
Maximus Aquila says, I know you keep asking, but please consider doing the Connection series by James Burke after Adam Curtis. It was from 1978, Connections.
Sorry, Simon, I think there was jazz in the Soviet Union, actually.
Oh, of course. They were compromised, like Hodges said, yeah.
They had jazz music, I know that.
Yeah.
Full Spectrum Submission says, it feels like being a toffee member of the 40s, British establishment, involved in espionage to scupper Jerry in the Med, is probably a man living his best life. Yeah, it does seem like that, doesn't it? Coney says, Peter Kemp of Mine Were of Trouble, Spanish Civil War fame, trained communist partisans in Albania during World War II. His second book, No Colours or Crest, under Enver Hoxha, Albania built an estimated 170,000 to 750,000 concrete bunkers. It is also the first officially atheist country in the world.
That's right.
So there we go. Very interesting stuff. I do have an update on the videos being paywalled. They should now actually be behind the paywall. I used a metric where anything below 21,000 views has been paywalled on the lower time preference bracket, older than a month. So this last month, if you're still playing catch up, you can still watch. Anything that failed to break the 21,000 mark is now paywalled. You know, so if you're a member at that level, you get a lot of videos, a lot of extra videos. Because let's face it, all of the views come in the first 2 weeks, right? And then you're kind of like picking up. It's very seldom the case that an old video will pick up that many views after the first 2 weeks that it goes out. So then it becomes like, well, a collection for people who want to go and, you know, be talking about this and that. So there we go. Like a kind of Netflix. Go on, Simon.
I was just going to send a link in the private chat. I don't know if you can see it there, but just continuing on the jazz theme of today, if you could just bring up this page. It's a page for a restaurant. It's Nigel Farage's favourite restaurant, apparently. It's called the Boysdale. It's run by a arch Brexiteer called Ranald MacDonald. And if you just scroll down the page, you can see it's all kind of trad decor there.
Yeah.
You know, you can see this. If you just head down to the bottom and see what they've got below the food and entertainments.
I see the entertainments, yes.
There's the sensibility.
He loves it, you know.
Jazz everywhere.
Lots of jazz down here. Okay.
You click through to that section, there's even more. There's like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
However, I do see, look, they've got a cigar section. Let's have a look at their cigars list. Let's have a look.
Yeah. They have a sort of outdoor cigar place where you can go and
I see.
Smoke.
Very expensive, though. Look, 25 quid for a half Corona.
Is it like wine bottles in restaurants? They mark it up with like...
Yeah, you're paying premium prices there. You know, a connoisseur should set you back maybe 35 quid, something like that. They're basically done like almost doubling the prices. If you have a look.
Churchill there? Because there must be a Churchill if Nigel goes there.
Let's have a look.
Does it have a band on it?
It'll be, they all have bands on them. These ones, but there's a vintage Churchill look for 300 quid.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got a quick cigar question. What is a Cohiba Robusto a good cigar? Is that a famous one?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's absolutely premium though. Actually, that's not a bad price for a Cohiba Robusto, considering the venue. You know, Cohibas are generally very expensive. But their prices are not that bad on the Cohibas. But do you see that Bahique limited edition there? They're not listing the price because you're probably going to spend more than £1,000 on that thing. you know. So that's probably the ones Nigel smokes because he's absolutely minted, isn't he? So anyway, anything you want to promote, Taurus, before we get out of here?
I'll give a quick shout out to my man Gavin Bobby, who's trying to stop a mosque application in Gravesend. I'll post the link in the chat. My own links are below the video. Thanks, everyone.
And Simon?
Yeah, I would just shill your culture video today about how to think about framing your fight back in the culture war. You need, I mean, essentially, it does also boil down to rubbishing the opposition. A lot of people may not like that, but that is part of your strategy if you are going to be involved in culture.
Yes, yeah. I think it's an interesting thing to think about it. Almost in a value. It's almost like doesn't matter if you like jazz, if you dislike jazz, if you like the people who did it, if you dislike the people who did it. It is more important how did they actually do it. You know, how did they do
and
it?
it's a great breakdown. I mean, you could use that as a manual. Anybody wanting to sort of, you know, start this new wave of cultural onslaught, do bear that in mind. It's not enough just to think that merit alone will be enough to get you through.
Cheers. And pick up a course at the Academic Agency course, Trivium, buy it now. Most importantly of all, friends, guess out.
What goes on in this town is none of your business.
As long as I'm living here, it is.
Then maybe you shouldn't be living here!
Well, that's easily fixed.